I'd like to welcome everybody to this segment of our virtual town hall. I'm going to ask everyone to clear your space and your thoughts and distractions if you're able to. For those with family members and children at home, I acknowledge that this may not always be possible. But for those who are able to, please turn off your phones, TVs, and social media. We acknowledge that the Waterloo region is situated on the land traditionally used by the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence and deep traditional knowledge and philosophies of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today. I would ask us to take a moment to reflect on our individual, community, and government commitment to the truth and reconciliation calls to action. Reconciliation is about repairing and remediating old relationships, developing new connections, and ensuring that these are nurtured on an ongoing basis from a place of truth and respect. Racism exists in Canada and Waterloo region. It requires real action, not a political response alone. We have to address racism in all of its forms. Regional Council unanimously passed a motion on June 16, 2020, following the Black Lives Matter march in our community. We confirmed our commitment to address racism by supporting policies and programs that address the inequities that members of the Black community continue to experience within Waterloo region. We are committed to action. The idea for a town hall came from the community conversations as an opportunity for the community to share stories, experiences, and to provide guidance to the region on the path forward to ensure our actions and decisions are community informed. My regional council colleagues and I are listening to your voices and the ideas that come from the community today, just as we did last evening. We recognize that sharing and listening to stories is emotional labor. For support during the town hall today, please reach out to Corizon through their intake line 226-929-6819, and they will connect you with a support coordinator. I believe that the specific demands referenced by our community, which include defunding the police, provide an opportunity to effect change. However, these changes that affect the entire community, and if progressive change is to come, it will require the support of the entire community. Although a number of actions outlined by Black Lives Matter and the wider community do fall under the jurisdiction of Waterloo region, there has been demonstrated community response to many of these, including the suspension and a review of the School Resources Officer program by local school boards and the community outreach program by local municipalities. While the region approves a police budget, it also funds many social development and supportive programs in the community that support marginalized people. Calling 911 has become our 24/7 default. It is the first call we make, and it is often the last resort. Police services are being pulled into social assistance and mental health calls. There is an opportunity to review our allocation of resources in the most appropriate way to support social development programs and effect meaningful change in programs and services and policies to address systemic racism and oppression within our community. Today we will listen. For those watching and listening online, and for those unable to speak, you can also provide your input and join in the conversation online on our Anti-Racism Initiative engagement page. I would now like to introduce Colleen Sargent-James. Colleen is our moderator for the town hall today, and she is a lifelong resident of Waterloo region. She's a professor at Conestoga College and owner of Devonify EDI Consulting. Thank you, Colleen.
Thank you, Chair Redman. Welcome to everybody who is watching and listening virtually. I want to welcome everyone back to our continuation from last evening's discussion. Yesterday ended a little earlier than anticipated. There were a few last-minute cancellations, things come up. So today I will tell you that we have a full panel of speakers who are just waiting to speak to the region. Yesterday we heard from residents in our community who demanded action. They described specific challenges, changes that need to happen, and readdressed the calls to action that have been made. We received feedback on possible representatives that could participate in our anti-racism advisory committee. One major takeaway is that talk is cheap. So unless there is action, the community is no longer patient. Regional Council has committed to addressing racism, and the community is holding them accountable to act on their commitment. Just want to say that some of the work that has led to this town hall has included conversations with the City of Toronto and their anti-Black racism secretariat, as well as looking at the City of Ottawa's anti-racism strategy and discussions with other municipalities. One thing that needs to remain clear is that what comes out of this town hall and this conversation and engagement with the public is that whatever happens is unique and specific to the region of Waterloo. This is a community engagement piece, and it's essential to making sure that the actions that come from this are a direct reflection of the work that the community wants and needs. This work is not easy. This is a long process, and at times it can be exhausting, and it will make people feel uncomfortable. For many of us who have experienced pain and repeated trauma, some of us who have had the courage to speak, know that your voice has the ability to make others stand up and speak out. A movement may take one person to start, but it has the ability to inspire others to speak up. So I want to thank those who spoke yesterday. There is a feedback form that the region will also be providing to the community, and I will encourage, and I think that the voices need to be heard, and this is the moment. And your acts of speaking up encourage others and inspires others who often feel voiceless to as well speak up. History has proven that it takes more than one voice. We have a lot of speakers today, so I don't want to hold back the presentations any longer. Note that there will be a break at noon for about 10 minutes. No matter how diverse or how intelligent or smart a community is, it is no stronger than its most vulnerable, marginalized, oppressed members of the community. As long as our community continues to oppress our racialized members, especially our BIPOC community, we all cannot thrive and survive. I will repeat the few housekeeping rules that applied last night. Each speaker will have 10 minutes. There will be a 2-minute warning letting you know to finalize your comments. You will be notified when you have reached your 10-minute limit. I ask you to please be respectful of the 10 minutes because we do have a lot more speakers than we did last night. Today's town hall is an atmosphere where all voices are welcomed. While speaking, please be mindful of others' confidentiality. Please do not share others' stories without their without their permission. We will not tolerate any inappropriate, derogatory, or defamation to others, or any hate speech. We invite you to share your stories and opinions, remembering that we are all here in the spirit of community building and progress. Attendance at this meeting signifies your consent. If, however, such comments are made, your video, your microphone will be turned off and your presentation will end. So again, I want to thank the speakers who are here today, and let's get started. So do we have, I believe, Lang will be the first speaker this morning. Hi, Lang, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good to go.
Perfect. So hello, everyone. My name is Lang, and I'm a Waterloo resident. Initially, I came to the region to complete my undergraduate degree at the University of Waterloo. And now for the past 5 years, I've grown to consider Kitchener-Waterloo to be my home and my community. So I want to start off my 10 minutes today by tracing the inception of this town hall. On June 3rd, the ACB Network, Black Lives Matter Waterloo Region, and community organizers led a march of over 10,000 people across downtown Kitchener in protest of police brutality and other forms of anti-Black racism. With this protest, calls to action were put forth requesting that Waterloo Regional Police Services be defunded by $29.3 million, and to then have those funds reinvested into social services like housing, harm reduction, public health, mental health, and many other social services. Following that, on June 20th, 2020, Indigenous activists occupied land in Victoria Park, Kitchener, to exercise their treaty rights and to reclaim their land for traditional meeting grounds. This was also done in protest of Canada Day because there's nothing celebratory about the genocide of Indigenous lives that were lost to create this nation. So after that event, on July 5th, another incident occurred where Mr. Omar, a gentleman with known mental health issues, was the victim of a violent police interaction. It has been asked since then for our region to acknowledge this incident and to acknowledge the persistence of police violence on Black people. What followed after these events were both private and public conversations from both organizers and residents asking our regional representatives to listen and to take from community members about the calls to action that have been put forth. And in response, the region created this town hall. So the reason why I mentioned the inception of the event is because I want everyone to be able to realize how white supremacy functions and how it's manifested. So the act of having this exploitative medium of having people share their darkest, painful, and even shameful moments of suffering while almost sensationalizing our pain, that is deeply rooted in white supremacy. The circumvention, the going around recommendations and suggestions already put forth in favor of an event based on trauma, reliving trauma and storytelling, that is white supremacy. So once again, there's this creation of a trap where the first step in tackling anti-racism work begins with the burden of proof on BIPOC individuals. I would say it's pretty evident that incidents of racism exist here within our region. Every single week for the past month or two, there's been an incident of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous, anti-POC propaganda, ranging from hate speech and white power posters being plastered on our streets in downtown, on hiking and running trails, to having a council member, one of the people that we're sitting here trying to sell our stories of racism to, by the way, who's also the mayor of a regional township, repost a White Lives Matter video on his Facebook. So I would say, yeah, it's pretty clear that racism exists here, and it doesn't need, or you don't need me or 30 other people to recount their trauma for a white audience, which would be our regional council, just to appeal to their empathy or for them to find value and recognize the value in our lives. It's almost, or it is actually honestly insulting. It's insulting to be asked to revisit some of our darkest moments just to validate that our pain and experiences are real. And it's insulting that we have to sit here and prove that racism exists through our experiences when the proof presents itself every single day. So proof presented itself when Waterloo region was one of the areas within Canada that had the highest population of white supremacist hate groups. There's your proof. And proof presented itself when Waterloo region had the highest amount of hate crimes within all of Canada in 2011. So this conversation shouldn't be centered around how racism has impacted me, because it is well documented that racism impacts my Black life within healthcare, education, employment, housing, economic mobility, and pretty much every other facet of our society. So I don't need to sit here and say that, nor should I have to sit here and say that. So what we need to shift our focus to now is, where do we go from here? And so the only question I'm really going to address for today's town hall is who should be sitting on the advisory committee. So I am hopeful for the committee and the work that's going to be done through it. And I'm hopeful that the individuals chosen to participate in the committee will be those that can bring a critical race lens to the conversation, which can also use theoretical frameworks to dismantle systemic oppression. I also hope that community members and activists who have an organizing history within the region, whether they're old or young, will also be able to sit on this committee, as they can bring the practical approaches that address the specificity of racism within our region. I hope that we can have a healthy mix of academic and non-academic representation, as both perspectives are necessary for this conversation. So change is absolutely not comfortable, and you should not be looking for people that make you feel comfortable, because that is an act of avoidance. That is avoiding feeling uncomfortable and avoiding actually addressing the issues at hand. So I say that you need to have individuals that are not afraid to challenge the current systems as well as the current powers that be. Thank you. That was all for today.
Excellent. Thank you, Lang. Okay, next we have Beisan.
Hi.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
good morning. You can begin when you're all set up and ready.
Great. Hi, my name is Beisan Zubi. I'm really happy to be here, but also conscious that I am taking up space from others in doing that. I'm hoping that my comments coming will be relevant and helpful. I am a cis femme Palestinian Canadian. I am very active locally. I sit on several boards of directors. I actually recently launched a program to help BIPOC people get on boards of directors locally. And I work as a consultant in diversity and inclusion, corporate social responsibility, most generally working with startups in the region, but I've also moved on to working with nonprofits as well. Many of you might know me because I actually ran for regional council in 2018. I was one of only 2 non-white candidates running for regional council in that entire election. At the very beginning, I was told by several influential people in town that I was more electable than the other non-white candidate, which I think is just code for more white passing. I don't wear hijab, saving me from the blatant Islamophobia that the other candidate faced, even though my dad is Muslim. I don't have an accent. I don't speak with accented English, so if I called you and I told you my name was Karen, you'd believe me. And, I'm light skinned and I'm often, called ethnically ambiguous, and people are super curious to find out what my background is because they want to know more, and it's so exciting and intriguing. So that's how my race kind of manifests. And so I just watched in horror as my fellow candidate just received so much abuse, Islamophobic hate, defaced signs, slammed doors, that I escaped because of that privilege. And then my electability and my ambiguity vanished for me when I brought up race. And when I brought up that another candidate called me an ethnic, and I tweeted about it, despite leaving their name out of it, they then accused me of lying, and I had to go on the radio to tell my side of the story, which I just still don't understand. What was I debating? Whether I was telling the truth or whether it was okay to say that to me. Fellow candidates refused to talk to me in public, lest they be seen as taking sides on the issue. People accused me of trying to make it about race when it didn't have to be about race. Like I said, no non-white person has ever been elected to regional council. And you're telling me it's not about race and that race is imagined in that? When I started publicly advocating for defunding and reallocating resources away from the police and into the community, I was told I was becoming unelectable, which I now understand as code for challenging white supremacy and forms of oppression. So an incident specifically has led me to kind of refine my views on defunding the police. And it's an incident that happened on September 20th at 1 a.m. on the corner of Queen and Charles in downtown Kitchener. I was at a speakeasy with a couple of friends. I had some cocktails, quite overpriced. And afterwards, we were out on the street and we were waiting for an Uber to stop. And I see this kind of dumpster and it's filled with glowing packing material. And I'm so curious. So I go and I kind of look over the side of the dumpster. And then I hear Beisan, and I turn around, and there's a cop car with lights, kind of the whoop thing happening. And I just jump off, and I'm like, "Hi, officer. Can I, what's the issue here?" And the officer goes, "What are you doing out here so late, you dirty girls?" Dirty girls. Oh. And if you know me, you know what my reaction to being called a dirty girl was. I was like, excuse me? What I am is a member of the Sexual Assault Support Center Board of Directors, and I know exactly what the Waterloo Region Police Service is doing. It's a result to like gender-based policing. And I just like, I yelled at the police officer for saying that to us, saying that to women who were just standing on the street. And without a word, the two cops look at each other, turn around, and drive away. Nothing. No explanation. No, don't do that again. Nothing. They saw the privilege that I was able to show them, that I had connections, that I was in circles of influence, spheres of influence, and they decided it wasn't worth their time. What makes things worth their time? The criminalization of poverty, the criminalization of mental health issues, of addiction, of unemployment, of walking while, Black or Indigenous. These are the things that, I guess were the laws that I could have been breaking at the time that would have demanded, that kind of a response and that kind of derision from the police officers. I didn't tell this story for a while because I was embarrassed. Like, I'm out, I'm having a good time. Did I do something wrong? Maybe you've had a similar interaction with the police that stuck with you. Didn't go badly necessarily, but stuck with you. While I was obviously creeped out by the officer's predatory language and tone, I wasn't harmed in that interaction, despite being racialized. White supremacy, my privilege, my connections, my friends, my confidence were all a shield. I want to emphasize this just for light-skinned BIPOC people as well. What if I had been Black? 3 Black guys on that street. What if we had been Indigenous? What if my kind of reaction had been taken as threatening and I was arrested? What if I had been put in a tank? What if there were all these other social issues that were weighing on me that meant that interaction that I went home that night and I didn't have any sort of long-term repercussions from ruined my life? But it's easy to kind of extrapolate to that level, but I get anxiety attacks. If I'm having an anxiety attack and somebody touches me, what happens in that case? And so this interaction, these what ifs just kept swirling around in my head until I realized, how can we abide this as a community? How can we abide such dramatically different outcomes to normal life events that are just dictated based on your circles of influence, your spheres of influence? If you're white, maybe this is the first time you're grappling with this. If you're Black and Indigenous, you're like, yeah, we know. And I'm so sorry it's taken me this long to get to where I am. I'm an intersectional feminist. Intersectional feminism argues that different systems of oppression work in tandem to help uphold each other. So you can't look at racism without also looking at class, without also looking at health and all that stuff. And so when we're talking about an anti-racism directorate, even talking about racist experiences is one facet of it. Let's talk about the fact that a study came out of Toronto saying that Black people, that racialized people have much worse COVID-19 health outcomes. So what's the Region of Waterloo Health Department doing about making sure that we have race-based data, that we're providing extra PPE to vulnerable communities, all that kind of stuff? When we talk about race as though it's this siloed issue of anti-racism through this experience of this one lens, we are missing out on all the different policy implications that racism and systemic oppression have. So when we talk about Black trans lives, we are acknowledging that Blackness and homophobia, transphobia don't take turns. They don't like, hey, I'm tagging out, you come in here. They work and they expand and they're exponentially more harmful. So I obviously am in favor of the BLM demands, but I think that when we're talking about the region and what the region can do, we can go even further than that. I keep hearing when we talk about community centers, sexual assault survivor support, accessibility, affordable housing, addiction, mental health. Where's the money? Where's the money going to come from? Well, if we found you 30 million, we can find you 50, we can find you 100. It is there.
2 minutes
if
remaining.
you just reimagine the way that you are looking at how you're going to be looking at solving this problem. Another thing that we need to do is elect more Black and Indigenous people to regional council. I don't know how long it's going to take until we can actually convince the minds of the people who have been elected this entire time. We can do that by encouraging term bylaw reviews, creating Black and Indigenous positive spaces. We have so many different tools available at our disposal, and we just need to be able to use it. Talk is great, conversations are wonderful, but we have metrics, we know where we are, we know where we want to be. So we have to hold people's feet to the fire and make sure that we are actually implementing changes. So thank you so much for listening. I really do hope, I'm so excited to hear the rest of the dissertations, the rest of the interventions, to really just keep listening to this. But at the end of the day, just to echo, we need to act, we need to be creative, we need to be innovative, we need to be representative. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, next we have Selam. Hello, welcome. Go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, welcome. Can you hear me, Colleen?
Yes, you're good.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak and address the region. I'm an Ethiopian Canadian cisgender woman who was born in Amman, Jordan, and raised primarily by my single mother. My parents came to Canada when I was 2 years old after fleeing on foot to Sudan and then moving to Jordan due to the government regime and unrest. They came here in 1984 for a better life and for themselves. I grew up in some of the most underserved and overexploited neighborhoods in Ontario, in Regent Park and in Scarborough. We were always surrounded by yellow tape, police presence, cockroach-infested apartments, and a constant feeling like we were being watched, because we were. To escape those invisible cages in which my mother had to work multiple jobs to sustain us, she moved myself and my sister, who was 9 years younger, to Kitchener-Waterloo. I can still remember her clearly saying to all her friends and family, "I'm moving to Kitchener for a better life. I'm moving here to save my daughter." And she moved us here to Kitchener with me kicking and screaming. And where did we end up, you ask? Where? Well, more underserved neighborhoods, Chandler, Mowat, and then, of course, Paulander. She was trying to save me from the neighborhoods that I can almost be confident that no one on this region's council members would know anything about. Why? Because we were the forgotten people, the Somalis, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Jamaicans, Nigerians, Sudanese, Grenadian, Trinidadian, Ghanaian, and more, those who were not fully human, 3/5 a human to be exact. The cycle continued of living in concrete jungled housing units, invisible cages, and a constant reminder of how this community saw us. And outside of our homes and hoods full of injera, bunna, culture, and surveillance was whiteness. Kitchener-Waterloo taught me how to code switch. I learned in high school that the only way to truly survive in KW was to code switch, to speak white in the presence of authority, teachers, employers, and peers, and settler power, and then be myself when I was within my own community. I'll never forget that day taking the bus home from Resurrection High School in grade 10 and sitting at the back of the bus witnessing this man berate this young Hispanic teenager. I encouraged the teenager to not engage as if he would be the one arrested, of course, and not this man. The Hispanic boy said, "Thank you," and got off the bus. The man looked at me and said angrily, "Who the hell are you talking to? I hate you niggers and your kind," he said. "Put out your hands. Why are the palms of your hands white and clean and the rest of your body dirty? Did you not clean yourself today?" No one even lifted their heads up. No one did anything on the bus that day to help. I went home and internalized that hatred for many years to come. I have been called the N-word in this community more times than I can remember. Thrown against a cop car face down while taking the last bus home while in college. Watching 6 officers with their knees in my partner's back. He wasn't resisting. We did nothing. We were just going home. I have seen the breakdown and stealing of our Black youth's potential, watching Black peers go from excited and about learning to suspended, expelled, and pushed to the streets and seen as a menace to society. I have seen how white youth with drug addiction and mental health challenges are seen as victims, seen as vulnerable, and in need for support. while our Black and Indigenous youth are seen as threats and imprisoned with harsh sentences. I see how we as Black people make up only 3% of the Canadian population, but equate to over 10% of bodies imprisoned. There are 70% more Black Canadians in federal prison today than there was 10 years ago. We are being mass incarcerated. We are being surveilled in our neighborhoods, Paulander, Chandler Mowat, Sunnydale, Brybeck, and many more. We are being overwhelmingly carded. We are met by 6 to 18 police officers for wellness checks. We have seen the knees on our necks right here in Ontario. An officer repeatedly beating this Black youth into submission. And the Somali young man who we all know of experiencing a mental health crisis right here in Kitchener, who was beaten and wrongfully arrested. We have seen the horrific images of Indigenous peoples being brutalized by RCMP. We see the images of blackface in our leaders, the hideous acts of flyers being distributed in our neighborhoods of the embedded scientific beliefs of eugenics, the white supremacist groups gaining momentum, the hate crimes are gaining force, the insidious ways in which Black and Indigenous people are being violated and repeatedly traumatized. And you ask why? How could this be? This is not Canada, you say. We are rooted in equality, multiculturalism, tolerance, and belonging. Canada is not benevolent. Forgetting to mention that Canada was built and founded on the stealing, cultural genocide, and the murder of Indigenous peoples, the enslavement of Black women, men, and children for 2 centuries, segregation in many parts of the country like Nova Scotia, racist policies that prevented Black people from migrating here, and a very dark historical inheritance of anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, and hate right here in Kitchener. We still have statues of racist settlers and murderers surrounding us. Our children go to these schools named after them, and they internalize this false history of being the pioneers of the Underground Railroad. Canada enslaved Black human bodies and the families, and pillaged and raped the lands of First Peoples. This colonial mindset of violence, assimilation, control, looting, and the devaluing of Black and Indigenous peoples is ingrained and embedded into every single institution of this community and in this country. White supremacy is real, and it is not wearing a white hat. It is sitting in boardrooms. It is insidious. It is complex and interlocking, and it's often racism with a smile. The truth is that Kitchener-Waterloo is one of, if not the most racist community that I have ever lived in. And it maintains the status quo by upholding racist policies, boards, organizations, and primarily white-only spaces. How is it that over 89.5% of Kitchener employees are white? How is the regional council and white community members not appalled and outraged by this? This is unacceptable. And like Desmond Cole said just this week, Black death isn't a teaching moment for white people. Why did you have to watch someone die to wake up? End quote. Let's be clear. Black organizers have been calling in for change in this community for decades. The ACB Network, ACWA, Caribbean and African associations, as well as many elders have forged the work of anti-racism in this community. We stand on their shoulders and are simply building on the work that they have done. On that day, June 3rd, over 30,000 folks showed up to the KW Solidarity March for Black Lives Matter, the largest BLM protest in Canada. We risked our lives during a pandemic. Why? Because like MPP Laura May-Lindos said that day, anti-Black racism is a public health crisis. My 15-year-old son deserves a better life in this community, where he is not being asked for the N-word on a daily basis, where he doesn't have to read a Snapchat post that says niggers are gone, #epic on his way from the Black Brilliance Conference, where he doesn't have to memorize the exact steps to take when he is stopped by police, how slowly he should move his hands from his pocket, his tone he should use, the way he should try to look the least bit threatening as possible. And then even though he is my baby boy, I know that he's getting bigger, taller, and gaining more autonomy. Implicit bias training and body cameras will not prevent an officer from seeing his body as a threat. Defund the police and reallocate $29.3 million into social mental health programs and supports. Invest in the neighborhoods that are invisible to you towards wellness and upliftment. Stop surveilling our youth and creating the school to prison pipeline. We need Black teachers. We need Black businesses. We need Black art and acknowledgement of the contributions from Black and Indigenous community members right here in KW and throughout this country. These white-only boards, councils, schools, teachers, and principals are unacceptable. Shame. There is big work to do. Deep repair needed and a reconciliation for all the lives that have been lost and fallen through the cracks. To what? To simply not caring, to simple white privilege and a nonchalant attitude towards Black and Indigenous lives? Now is not the time for pacification. We are tired. No more lip service. We want change, real, tangible, systemic, and urgent change. Black lives matter, Indigenous lives matter, trans spirit lives matter. I am outraged by Kitchener-Waterloo's slow arrival to the spot of acknowledging anti-Black racism, and so is our community. We are watching. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Kathy. Go ahead when you're ready, Kathy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me this morning. My name is Kathy Hogarth. I am a professor in the School of Social Work at Renison University College at the University of Waterloo. I have lived in this community for the last 17 years. I have invested my life in this community. I want to start in terms of the questions you've asked us to answer. I will echo some of the sentiments echoed before. We do not need to hear the experience of another beating. We do not need another death. We do not need the parading of our experiences of racism for a region to act. History tells us, our prison system tells us, our child welfare system in our region tells us. The disproportionate levels of Black men who are being impacted negatively by our police system tells us we do not need another parade. This is what we refer to, or I refer to, as trauma porn, where we get some kind of sick pleasure by once again witnessing, hearing the trauma of Black bodies, of Indigenous bodies. It is sick. We do not need it. We have enough information on which to act. We need to act. In the past few weeks, 8 weeks, we've heard our Prime Minister. He said, we are better than that. He was referring to Canada in relation to the US. Our Premier, Doug Ford, said, thank God we do not have the deep roots of racism like the US. The Premier of Quebec said, Quebec does not have a system of racism. And the commissioner of the RCMP, Commissioner Lockie, said, the RCMP does not have a systemic racism problem. These are all leaders of our country. And what they've echoed to us is a sentiment that is very prevalent among the general population of our country. We do not have a systemic racism problem. But what they have indicated to us, and we can use this, we can enter this as evidence for the work that we need to do. What they've indicated in very clear ways to us is that our education system fails. let's be reminded that Amy, a New York Park racist, is a product of Waterloo region. She was schooled at the University of Waterloo, and she knew how to weaponize her whiteness against a Black man. This is our education system failing us at all levels. So when we ask ourselves, what do we need to do? We need to change our education system. That's one. Calls to defund the police. There are many who would say, well, what do we do without a police system? Well, there are many communities that work without a police system, actually, and they work quite fine. But calls to defund the police aren't calls to remove the police. They are calls to address the overreach of policing. We cannot police racism. Well, should not police racism, but we have been policing race. We should not police poverty, yet we have been policing poverty. We should not police mental health, but we have been policing mental health. Calls to defund the police are calls to address the overreach of police in areas like race and racism, like mental health, homelessness, and poverty. A few years ago, we had a focus group, a regional focus group, to look at oversight, policing oversight bodies. I remember it well. I was there. I sat with an SIU officer at one of my tables, a retired police officer from our region. He worked for all his career in policing and then left for the SIU. And this is what he said. The problem with the disproportional representation of Black men, the problem with carding is that Black people need to stop drawing attention to themselves. Those were his words. We have an overrepresentation. We have police actively targeting Black bodies, and it's their fault because they need not to be attracting attention to themselves. And so I ask, how do I attract that attention? By simply being Black. That, my friends, is a definition of racism. One that's built into a system. One that no little amount of sensitivity training is going to address. Who should be at our tables? Yesterday we heard from some of our speakers, and one of them said, nothing about me without me. It's something we borrow from disability theory and disability work. Nothing about me without me. Black, Indigenous folks are able to make decisions. They are able, they are autonomous. They can govern themselves.
2 minutes remaining.
We need to have Black folk, Indigenous folks at the table. Representation matters, not because you can use us as tokens. Representation matters because it is the doorway to meaningful participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Okay, next we have Lori. Hi, good morning, Lori.
Good morning. Tantse, Ninaskum, Mamawi, Otawamau, Mitani, Miwasin, Kotakisiga, Ewapata, Tamak. Nia Lori Campbell, Nia Two Spirit, Nehio, Pitikos, Sanasqueo. Nia Ochi, Muniawi, Sagahiganik, Treaty 6 Territory, Kiwitanok, Saskatchewan, Ochio. Hello and good morning. I thank the Creator because it's a beautiful thing that we get to see another day, and in particular the we, as in Black and Indigenous peoples in this community and the broader nation, because many of our brothers and sisters have not survived the violence of colonization, the state justice system, the state child protection system, the state education system, and the list could go on. I am a Two-Spirit Indigiqueer Cree Métis woman, and my ancestors are from Treaty 6 territory in northern Saskatchewan. I tell you this not because it defines me, but because it explains the lens through which I experience the world. There's great diversity among Indigenous groups across Turtle Island, because Saskatchewan is home to the Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, and Métis peoples. I want to first acknowledge that Kitchener-Waterloo is situated on lands deeply connected to Indigenous peoples who have historically lived and who currently live in this territory. These groups include the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Like the lands of my ancestors in Treaty 6 territory, I recognize that these particular lands have always been the source of learning for Indigenous peoples here, and I am committed to respecting the traditional knowledge that they have derived from these lands and to learning from their experiences on them. I am the director of Sidiji Rota, the Waterloo Indigenous Student Center, and adjunct lecturer Indigenous Studies at St. Paul's University College, an affiliated institution of the University of Waterloo. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Indigenous Studies, a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, a Master's in Adult Education, and I am in the process of completing a PhD in Social Justice Education. I am an intergenerational survivor of the residential school system and a child of the 60 Scoop generation. I have always known that I was adopted and known that I was Indigenous, but I didn't always know who I was or who I belonged to. My ancestral line was broken because I had been forcibly and intentionally severed from it. I wish I could say this is a unique individual experience, but I cannot. It is a common story for tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island and many who live within our region. I am proud to say that over the last 25 years, I have managed to locate and contact all 6 of my living siblings, scattered across Saskatchewan, Alberta, and here into Ontario, despite the state opposition to assisting me to do so. I don't share this because I want you to get caught up in the feeling empathetic. Yes, that's an important attribute to have. However, in instances such as this, I find that white people often find themselves getting caught up in their feelings of empathy and suddenly making the suffering of Indigenous peoples, in fact, about them. Somehow there is a shift whereby the suffering of Indigenous peoples becomes a suffering of the present-day white experience, ultimately erasing the experience of Indigenous peoples from the landscape altogether. I note you've asked Nichimo. Today you've asked for me to tell a story. Well, what I have shared is all the story I am interested in sharing. What I have shared is a story about Indigenous survival and the undeniable strength of my ancestors. My relatives have told their stories of pain, trauma, violence, and death that has been endured because of the racism of assimilation policies, the systems of genocide. They have told their stories so that I don't have to. They are written in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and they are written in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Inquiry. And a quick scan of any Indigenous person's social media will show you that racism is real and ongoing and is here in the region. The starting point of this town hall requesting Black, Indigenous, and racialized people to speak of their experiences of racism is extremely disappointing to me. Indigenous youth and community want action. They are ready to take action, and they are ready to hold elected leadership to account. They are asking me and others like me to put a stop to white leadership continuously requesting them to share trauma porn as though to reassure white people that racism is still real, is still ongoing, and is still our experience. It is, and that should have been the starting point for this conversation. I will tell you that the multiple issues with the process of the TRC and Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Inquiry were because colonial governance attempted to direct the work rather than support Indigenous leadership and community to do the work in a way that had impact and meaning for them. So I caution the leadership of the region in taking too many steps to direct anti-racism work as the outcome of which could only be a white version of what anti-racism should look like, and that will create more than simply distrust in the community. It will allow further racism to flourish in our community. With regards to which sectors I believe need to be represented on the advisory committee, my response is that Anti-Racism Advisory Committee does not need to be sector represented. Rather, it needs representation from the Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples who have the lived, scholarly, and strategic expertise of engaging in anti-racism work in our region 24/7. Many of which who have already provided the region free expert consultation on these matters prior to this town hall, as well as through this town hall. At my count, this expertise adds up to decades of experience right here in our regional backyard. I believe much of the final question has already been answered prior to this town hall. The region has an Indigenous land-back camp that has been thriving in Victoria Park since June 20th. It has been there for 41 days. Each and every day, members of the camp, many of who are youth, have been targeted by racism. I refer you to their social media to educate yourself. The organizers have put forward 4 very reasonable requests that our region can address immediately. Number 1, all fees be waived for the Indigenous communities to host events in public spaces. Number 2, land in Victoria Park, Waterloo Park, be given back to the Indigenous peoples. These spaces will be used for gathering and ceremonial purposes, much like the land occupation is doing in Victoria Park right now. Number 3, creation of paid positions at all levels for Indigenous peoples to be able to engage with Indigenous peoples living in this territory. And number 4, creation of an Indigenous advisory committee at paid positions that will work with the mayors and city councillors in helping to address topics such as racial justice, lack of access to Indigenous services and community spaces, and to addressing the TRC 94 calls to action. And to be clear, points 3 and 4 are not requests for the region to address the issues, but to create paid positions to hire Indigenous peoples to direct this work. In addition, the Black Lives Matter Waterloo Region and Anti-Racism Collective called for the defunding of the Waterloo Regional Police by a minimum of $29.3 million. That money needs to be reallocated and invested in the lives of those in our community who are targets of systemic racism perpetuated by a system that continues to pathologize Black and Indigenous peoples, the police system that is killing us with their improvements. A request was made for immediate action to reinvest the policing monies into community-led health and safety initiatives. A call was made to end the school resource officer program and the community outreach program, and to also invest in social support equity initiatives such as increased access to affordable housing, harm reduction services, accessible rehabilitation, conflict resolution services, reintegration services, and other vital community-based support systems. My experience tells me that some white people will fail to see the connection between some of the immediate actions that I have listed and the ties to anti-racism work. I have chosen not to spend my 10 minutes to provide that education. However, it does reinforce the necessity of ensuring this work is led by Black, Indigenous, and racialized peoples, who I also expect will receive pay for their expertise moving forward.
2 minutes remaining.
I wrote this first part of my statement last evening. This morning, I wrote this. Last evening was a difficult evening for me, and I am sure other BIPOC people, as we listened to peers in our community share their experiences of racism. After it was complete, I sat down to write my own statement. I drifted off into a disruptive sleep, both because of what I had heard and what I had prepared to share today. I was awoken 4 hours later by a message to inform me of yet another Indigenous life taken way too soon. A youth I had worked with throughout her teen years, now a young mom of 6, who has died from the system of improvements. What we need is for people in positions of power to open the space, step aside, and provide us the resources so we can take care of ourselves. And while we are doing that, leadership needs to take action to dismantle their systems of power, their improvements that continue to oppress, marginalize, and kill us. I will also add that Indigenous peoples know all too well the death that comes when federal and provincial governments fight like divorced parents over who is responsible to provide services to us. I ask that the region works through the invisible human-made lines of jurisdiction so that the Black and Indigenous peoples of our region will not continue to suffer while jurisdictional issues get sorted out. It is a matter of life and death. While the battles of jurisdiction are fought, we suffer and we die. This is the Indigenous experience in Canada, and this is the Indigenous experience within our region. Again, please remember, do not make my story of the suffering of my people about the suffering of white people positioning Black, Indigenous, or racialized people to be responsible for witnessing white suffering through gazing upon our suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lori. Next, we have Ismail. Good morning, Ismail. You can begin when you're ready.
Good morning, Colleen and Chair Karen Redman, and happy Eid to all of you. My name is Ismail Mohamed. I'm a resident of the city of Kitchener and a member of the ACB network. I sit and sat on many other boards and committees in this region. I want to thank those who had the courage to speak today and yesterday. It is hard to speak on issues that affect you. I will start off by saying the region of Waterloo is home to an increasing number of diverse residents who account more than 20% of our city's population. There's a strong evidence that members of racialized communities in the region and Canada face major inequities. Numerous government reports and community recommendations have articulated these inequities. On top of these generalized and at times normalized equity gaps, concerns about anti-racism, especially anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, have gained a greater public attention in recent months following the murder of George Floyd. Also, to include the recent violent arrest that took place in our region and continuously happening today. Our community is expressing frustration with lack of strategy resulting from ineffective community outreach and engagement by our institutions to address these frustrations. Region needs mobilization of common, strong voice against anti-racism and anti-Black racism. Institutions need a focused, effective outreach and engagement with diverse segments of our racialized communities. As for my personal experience, I will just use surviving, getting through, and getting past. I was at a community meeting when one of the elders in the community got up to speak, and he started his speech with, "Can I tell you something you already know?" I'm translating in English, but I can assure you it sounded better in his native tongue. So I'm not going to burden you with what you already know. Anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism is a culture in our institutions and corporations. Continuous and unrest surveillance of our marginalized youth. My phone rings once or twice every day from a community member seeking support to address issues in policing, lack of employment, and education and the education system. I will quote Kika Ojo-Thompson on the stories she shared on CTV. Racists are rewarded, and the people who try to do anti-racism work experience consequences in their organization. You can feel and hear the frustrations from members of the community when trying to address these issues we live in, and we live in it every day. What sectors, the other question is, what sectors do you believe need to be represented on the advisory committee? I will make this one short, precisely because I don't want to elaborate too much of what everyone else have said. I would say for sure these conversations need to be led by those who are affected by these issues. Black and Indigenous communities would be a good start. What areas should the region address immediately? Well, any anti-racism strategy must target systemic racism by building an anti-racism approach into the way our institutions work. Our institution works, makes decisions, and address community concerns. We should be proactive, collaborative effort, and work towards racial equity. Emphasis on policy, research, awareness, public education, and community collaboration must be a strong pillar. For example, we need to know how of our community is positioned. Therefore, we need to disaggregate it. We need to disaggregate it and race-based data. Let me elaborate on systemic racism. We need to examine the impact of systemic barriers and root causes of racial inequities and marginalization. Indigenous and racialized people must be meaningfully engaged in the systemic racism conversation. Their perspectives and guidance will inform the way forward. Our anti-racism strategy must be evidence-driven and must establish measurable goals and outcomes that are reported back to the community. Just to echo some of the comments made by my colleagues yesterday and today, ACB Network have done several consultations from the African and Caribbean Black communities in the region and made calls to action to address on policing and criminal justice, economic and employment, and health and wellness. This is upstream approach rather than downstream approach. The focus should be long-term. Our effort needs to be long-term focused, otherwise our efforts will go to waste. I will conclude. It is great that we started this conversation. I believe it's never too late to start, but based on the experiences and how long these communities suffered and or suffering, this went on far too long. We have racial inequality in our region, not because we want to, but it shows us the good intentions are not enough. We must have intention around our policies. We must work on policing and criminal justice, economic and employment, health, wellness, and investing in historically disinvested neighborhoods. These racial inequities did not just happen. They're not an accident. They are in many cases the consequences of racist policies, which means we have to have not just non-racist policies, but anti-racist policies if we're ever going to see these things equalize in our lifetime. What the community needs is action. Let's not disappoint them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ismail. Okay, next we have Stephen. You can go ahead when you're ready, Stephen.
Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Hi, I'm Stephen, CEO for Anishinaabeg Outreach. Chair, councillors, I appreciate the opportunity to provide Indigenous voice for the 50,000 Indigenous people living in the region. I appreciate the opportunity to share my experiences with leading large corporate transformations. I applaud regional leadership for beginning this journey and for the bravery of the other participants who have shared stories and ideas. First, a little bit about Anishinaabeg Outreach. Anishinaabeg Outreach is a large Indigenous organization, and we are creating a center of healing for Indigenous people living in the region. We have built an Indigenous employment agency, Indigenous-led early on, land-based learning, medicine gardens, and a traditional healing lodge on the lands that we have purchased. Since the pandemic began, we started delivering spirit bundles to hundreds of Indigenous families in need, families impacted by systemic discrimination. The spirit bundles include food, clothing, school supplies, cleaning supplies, masks, bikes, sports equipment, and more, even furniture. We thank all partner agencies and allies who have made this all possible through their generous donations. We have already delivered over 10 tons of food and supplies. We've grown a lot over the past 2 years, actually about 1,100%, and we still have a lot of growing left to do to complete our Center of Healing. Before leading Indigenous organization, I held head of HR positions and led corporate-wide talent management transformations for large corporations, including higher ed, police, and large governments. I also helped the region of Peel become the first government in Canada to achieve all levels of NQI. I've led or been involved in equity transformation since the 80s. Well, late 80s, really. My voice is not that of an activist. My perspective is different. I used measured consulting approach to build comprehensive system-based solutions. I'm pragmatic and results-oriented. My interest is in fixing systems that prevent reconciliation and therefore equity. I often focus on proactive solutions. For this journey to be successful, you need leaders to be good. I believe both Bruce and Karen to be strong leaders with a keen interest in seeing results in equity. For leaders to stand up and listen, there needs to be external pressure or pain. Well, there's a lot of pain out there, and this will help propel the initiative forward. We also have the gift of time. COVID has slowed or stopped normal business, which means we have a couple of years to make the necessary changes. We also have staff that can be reallocated to help make these changes. In other words, the stars have aligned. While we are in the midst of a real quagmire, for every set of problems, there are solutions. I think it is a mistake to react to a crisis and provide a crisis-based solution. Band-aid solutions won't fix anything. Equity needs a comprehensive strategy in order to create a permanent and sustainable change. I also think it's wrong to predetermine the solution by wanting to replicate Ottawa or Toronto. Emulating cities that have equity challenges is not a good idea, but they likely have some best practices that can be utilized and become part of the roadmap for our equity. So I'm advocating to start with a blank slate and creating the straw dog. Begin with best practice research. What has had positive impact elsewhere? This would take up to 6 months. Scope of the initiative is also important, probably the most important. It needs to include rebuilding all talent management programs and processes because they all can create barriers to equity. These are really your HR programs. Think recruitment, selection, compensation, onboarding, training, promotion, succession, leadership development. These are levers that can improve equity. This will take a couple of years to rebuild all of these. Scope will also need to include reviewing all policies and programs from an equity lens, and even rebuilding some or many to remove barriers. I encourage looking at programs that are preventative and not just reactive. You can begin employee engagement and sensing and citizen engagement and sensing with an equity focus. Determine current baseline and see how it changes as elements are implemented. After processes and programs are fixed, you'll need to assess and change culture. Yes, this is hard work, but it will help everyone with wanting and embracing equity. This will also make the change permanent. It will be a new way of being, an equity way of being. This will take a couple of years at least. Following this process will enable the region to move the needle on equity and make significant improvements. I would also recommend that the organization trained in change management, project management, and process management. This will help with the success and implementation of the changes. Project management will minimize how long each project takes, as well as ensure the scope is correct. Process management will reduce the costs and make it easier and more enjoyable, the work. Change management will reduce the implementation time. I would also recommend that equity be a standing agenda item for every council and leadership meeting, because what gets focused on gets done. You may even need to review your strategic plan with a new equity lens. I'm suggesting that you create a director-level position to build all of this. Provide resource staff for the Secretariat. I know from experience that writing council reports are an art form, with many rules only known to a few. Resource staff will need to do research and draft documents on behalf of the Secretariat. The roadmap will need to be in the range of 25 years, as equity change isn't a sprint, it's more of a marathon. However, much of the work could be achieved in the first 5 to 10 years. You're going to need a visionary on the Secretariat who can see past 25 years, because 1 year or 5-year plan simply won't create the changes needed. A booklet and a policy won't change anything. Indigenous teachings talk about solutions for 7 generations. So build something that will last 7 generations. In other words, way after us, all of us have contributed to this process. If the Secretariat is populated with a lot of activists' voices, you will get an activist solution. You will need a strong leader to manage the Secretariat. I'm advocating for many Indigenous voices on the Secretariat, depending on the size of it. Thought leaders, corporate leaders with expertise building programming and transforming systems. There are 50,000 Indigenous people living in the region. I personally consider Indigenous people our region's most vulnerable population. 50% of our homeless population is Indigenous. 75% of our children in care are Indigenous. 30% of prison populations are Indigenous. CBC did a review I saw last few days where it was really talking about police cause fatalities. 16% of police cause fatalities were Indigenous, which represents 4% of the population, while 8% fatalities were Black, which represents 3% of Canada's population.
2 minutes remaining.
This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of discrimination and racism against Indigenous people. I'm not sharing personal examples because we need to move past stories and into the system and program changes. I will share that I was part of the 60s scoop. So my systemic discrimination began at birth and continued through most systems impacting other Indigenous people today. I lived these systems, I know how to fix them. When I think of equity, I see it interwoven with reconciliation. If true reconciliation happens, then so does equity, and vice versa. For me, reconciliation is about justice, healing. But I don't believe justice is possible for Indigenous people. Healing is the important part of reconciliation because it provides a path forward. Healing is done through partnership and alliances. It has to be healing for everyone, not just Indigenous people. Otherwise, it won't work. Think systemic discrimination and unconscious bias and their impacts. So fixing equity will lead to reconciliation, or achieving reconciliation will lead to equity. I'm going to suggest the region partner with other organizations to create an equity alliance for the region. So police, family children's services, school boards, even tech companies and insurance companies. These systems interact and therefore can reinforce. I also believe that you need to partner with Indigenous, Black, and people of color agencies to deliver services different from today. I know many Indigenous people simply won't access services because they're provided by mainstream organizations. If all this is done, the region will be able to significantly move the needle on equity, which in turn will improve productivity, engagement, and citizen satisfaction. An added benefit will be saving millions of dollars by improving the process and performance. Thank you again for the opportunity. I really hope council members embrace the scope of the equity change on behalf of the next 7 generations. The benefits will be enormous.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Okay, next we have Tammy. When you're ready, Tammy, you can turn on your mic and begin.
Yes, good afternoon or good morning. Kwei, my name is Tammy Webster. I'm a registered member of my Algonquin community of Kitigan ZB. I come from a long line of Algonquin educators, leaders, and change makers. I am also the daughter of a residential school attendee, and as such, with experiences of both privilege and indigeneity. I moved to the region in 1990 when I attended university, and it has remained my home away from home. I have my BSc, my BA, my BEd, and my MEd. I am the Indigenous Education Lead Teacher with Waterloo Catholic District School Board, and I also sit on the school board's Equity, Diversity, and Learning Committee, as well as have a place at a community collaborative led by the Equity Inclusive Education Lead at Waterloo Region District School Board. I am the chair for Anishinaabe Outreach. I am a member of the Connectors Hub for Wellbeing Waterloo Region, as well as a member of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit Advisory and Advocacy Circle. I co-chair Waterloo Region Aboriginal Academic Advisory Committee. I am on the Children and Youth Planning Table, and I have been a part of their working group called Shared Foundation of Practice. I was also part of the advisory committee for Ken Sealing Waterloo Region Museum exhibit titled Trailblazing Women in Canada since 1867. My most recent community appointment is with The Record as a member of their community editorial board. So with all these credentials and professional experiences, I walk the world with privilege, and I can also hide in plain sight. I also have the lived experiences of a First Nations female who navigates systems and racism. The question of, what? You don't look Native, is a regular conversation starter for some. Or when I present my status card for purchases, I receive an eye roll, an exhaustive sigh of annoyance, as well as, really? You're native? So in many forms, when I express my credential and academic qualifications, as I have done already, the backhanded compliment that is grounded in the stereotype of an uneducated and unsuccessful First Nations woman is, wow, your family must be so proud of all your academic achievements. So yes, I have a very unique understanding of race and how it plays out in its many forms. However, this information that I presented is not my legacy, but is simply a piece of my identity. At this point in my life and my career, I am an expert on equity and often get asked for my opinion to provide advice, knowledge, and guidance. I am a leader in Indigenous education and well-versed in decolonizing education and government systems. So thank you to Chair Redman, councillors, and all staff who have started this process and have begun to communicate with the constituents of Waterloo Region. Acknowledging that there are issues in the region is the first step to make a sustainable and impactful reorientation of equity and racism practices for the region. While this first step is not easy, as it creates a vulnerability, everyone is aware of the benefit from embarking on that process. From my community involvement, I know that organizational and system leaders are aware of these racist and inequitable practices within their own systems. I also know that they want to create alliances, partnerships, and relationships with racialized and marginalized communities, but they do not have the necessary connections or relationships to move forward. There are no specific sectors that ought to be represented, but rather have representation by the authentic system leaders of various communities. Region organizations and sectors should not do this work in isolation from one another, or as an ad hoc or a knee-jerk reaction to crisis. But rather, they need to develop a long-term strategic plan that involves all the sectors and all the leaders. This is how to move the work forward. There has to be thought leaders, transformational leaders, equity leaders, system leaders, and organizational leaders that can represent and speak to the experiences that shape our interactions with the region and their services. These leaders have a community themselves that they can use and ensure that the experiences of the various communities are voiced as the temper when developing the long-term strategic plan. It ensures that the diversity of each of our own communities moves with us. With this gift of corrective action that has surmounted because of the loud voices and the need to move forward, I implore that the direction taken is one of reimagining possibilities, utilizing traditional and land-based knowledge systems from the various communities that make the region their home. From my perspective, we can no longer indigenize or tokenize cultural ways of being for systems, but rather, this incredible opportunity is a way for the region to continue their legacy of innovation and transformation. We cannot replicate past systems. We cannot use or adopt others' policies and processes, especially when they are grounded and built on oppressive frameworks. The evidence of the oppressive framework in these borrowed plans is demonstrated with the pervasive racist data of these communities that still exist. It has not worked, and these voices of crisis are echoing that the past is not working. So new steps and new paths need to be taken. Let's step away from trying to immediately fix a problem with Band-Aids. Band-Aids are only a temporary solution, are intended for emergencies and crisis. It is time to be brave, be bold, be innovative. By trying to fix a problem with a colonial solution, we are unconsciously reinforcing the colonial relationship that we are trying to move away from. So, instead of which sectors need to be represented, the question ought to be who needs to be represented. As an educator, follower of social media, and as someone who firmly and morally believes in this reconciliation work as being done in relationship with others, it is time that healing and relationships happen for everyone. As a First Nations woman who has done the necessary restorative work, access, managing, and coping in a system that has not healed itself is extremely difficult and oftentimes problematic, which is what leads me to my position on professional, personal, and community fronts. In my unique position of my privilege and my lived experiences, my recommendation to the region is to understand the process and resistances of marginalized and racialized communities. The activist voice in media is the voice that rallies the cries of support and resistance. The voices have been loud in recent times, and while activism is critical to create an awareness of an issue and provide solidarity for those groups' causes, multi-generational, sustainable, strategic plan needs to be put forth as a critical possibility and a hope-filled action. Only through this transformative and innovative process can we ensure that we do not replicate the violence and the legacy of a colonized system, but rather instill hope and healing to move forward. I also suggest that instead of naming this work as a journey, that the region take the step and name exactly where in this process of anti-racism and equity work they are. This is a process, and like any other process, there are tangible, nameable steps along the way, and I encourage that the region take the time to reflect and name where they are in this process. It will help pave the path of healing and transformation. Everyone will be aware of their place in the process, and it begins the preliminary work for the relationships and the conversations.
2 minutes remaining.
So to wrap, we all know systems are broken and are created on antiquated and oppressive methodologies and understanding. It is time to create a different roadmap that incorporates diverse leadership, voice, diverse cultural ways of understanding as the advisory instead of the sectors themselves in order to create this multi-generational strategic plan. Build relationships that move all people. Take a step away from past practices and look at the innovation that is present in our diverse community of Waterloo region. So thank you to all of our speakers, Chair Redman, counselors, staff, and all that have stepped up to engage in this meaningful and necessary conversation. Be bold, be brave, and be innovative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tammy. Okay, next we have Victoria.
Hello, good morning. Hi, my name is Victoria Rodney, and I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Waterloo. I currently serve as the Associate Vice President of Equity for the Undergraduate Student Association. I'm excited to know that Karen Redman, a member of the University of Waterloo's Board of Governors, is listening. I'm also excited to see how her connection to this work improves equity on campus. It's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to speak on this platform today. I wanted to first thank Lang and Kathy Hogarth specifically for their deputations today. They echo the frustrations of many Black people and our Indigenous kin in the struggle for liberation, and it feels as if both speeches were made especially for us, the Black students at the University of Waterloo. My experiences with anti-Black racism at the university starts in my very first year, when my friends and I were asked to collect statistics on how many Black students were on campus. Since then, we were fortunately able to establish RAISE, the very first, and might I add, only effective service on campus that addresses racism on campus. In recognizing the relationship between the university and the community, I think it's really important to acknowledge and understand the ways that both impact each other. In the same ways that Waterloo region is imperiled by anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, the University of Waterloo administration is similarly embroiled in and condones anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism. In the past month, racialized students have mobilized around the banner, Equity for Who. Their messaging emphasizes the systemic and insidious impact of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism that violates students and faculty at the University of Waterloo. To their list of the demands, the university has yet to produce any meaningful action that prioritizes or even acknowledges the experiences of racialized, how their staff and administration have participated, and also refused to take accountability for their violence. As many have said before me, the task of undoing the harms of colonialism is not easy. Change is not easy. And as Lang previously stated, it is in fact uncomfortable. To actualize real change, we must prioritize and center the voices that are currently at the margins. Black and Indigenous people, both in community and at university, and those who are fortunate to straddle the lines of both, must occupy seats at the proverbial table and have their recommendations acted upon. I call on the Waterloo region and the University of Waterloo to heed the words of Black and Indigenous people that have long been involved in this radical and historical change work, to give up their spaces and allow Black and Indigenous organizers to lead this work in order to actualize longstanding change that ensures a promising future for all. For all listening, please find Equity for Who on social media, read their open letter, read their many posts that share the injustices that occur on our campuses. I encourage you all to echo their asks and become accomplices in seeing this change work through. I've received permission from the group to share that if you'd like to be in touch with them, you can connect through social media. I encourage you to share their efforts with your networks and ask the media to use their platform to amplify the work of this group. For members of all government listening in today, please connect with the Waterloo Undergraduate Student Association to work with students at UW on this work. Unfortunately, we're not in a position to trust the administration to get this work right, and we feel that we must prioritize the voices of students, staff, and faculty in order to really see a much better University of Waterloo. You can connect with me by emailing at equity@wusa.ca, and I will put you in touch with our stakeholders relations officer. And that is everything for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Next, we have Shay.
Good morning.
Good morning. You can begin.
Okay. I apologize if I stumble on my words today. This is a pretty personal topic, so I'm just kind of nervous about it. Thank you for allowing me to have a platform today. My name is Shay Dipraseuth. I go by Shay. The only people that call me by Shay Khan are my wife and mother, and it's usually because I'm in trouble for something. I was born and raised in Kitchener. My parents are from Laos. Where is that? Thailand. If you knew where Laos was already, thank you. I find that I usually have to explain where it is. The next thing I usually get is, well, you don't look Asian. You look like a minority, but not Asian. You know, it's as if all Asians look the same or something. Here's an experience that that happened to me a few weeks ago in a region when I was out shopping with my father-in-law, who is Caucasian. I'm at the register, the cashier. Glad we could help you get what you wanted today. Can I just get your information for the system, please? No problem. Name? Shay Dipraseuth. Where are you from? Kitchener? Where are your parents from? What's your background? My father-in-law. He's from Canada. I love my father-in-law and laughed when he said that. I didn't think anything of the time, but as I was writing this, that memory came to me. For my father-in-law to speak up on my behalf, he knew something wasn't right. I was just used to it. I love that I'm Laotian. I love that I'm Canadian. I'm not considered Canadian though, because my name isn't Western sounding. Canadians pride themselves in being multicultural, a cultural mosaic I once heard. Yet, we still ask people what backgrounds they come from. We have to stop doing that and start looking at people as people. I've dealt with racism quite a bit in this region. Racism, I want to be clear, doesn't come from just one ethnicity. Caucasian, Asian, Black, in all cultures, racism exists. In this region, I've had Laotian people be racist to me. My own people, who I take so much pride in, have been some of the most racist I've experienced. I was raised in a Muslim religion as a child. I remember I wore a robe and a hat, traditional outfit to school one time. The kids teased me. The school called my mom. She had to come and explain that it was our religion why I was dressed a certain way. They didn't call her because I was getting teased, but because of the way I dressed. As a kid, I didn't understand. Why would my mom have to come to the school to explain my outfit? As an adult now, I'm not a Muslim, but I see the looks they get from people out on the streets. That's not fair for them. It's not okay that Asians are being targeted right now and blamed for coronavirus and the hate they receive. I'm in a grocery store and I see people move away from an Asian person to avoid them. That is racism, even if you don't say anything. I get followed when I go to stores. I remember going to a store, I won't name it, but I was shopping and I noticed someone was following me. It was loss prevention. I befriended one of the guys, and after a while he told me that he remembers following me in the store because I was a minority. He said they're trained to look at the camera, and basically if they see minorities, they keep an extra eye on them. That hurt. I think that minorities should be able to walk around a store and feel that you're welcomed. I would love to support local, but because of the experiences that I've had, I do most of my shopping online. I take a lot of pride in being Canadian. I love the freedom that we have in the life I live here. I love this region. I'm very proud to be Laotian. My wife is Caucasian. We have 2 beautiful girls. I say this and it's going to hurt. My wife and I have spoken, and this breaks my heart. With all the chaos going on, I said to my wife, I'm glad my girls don't look Laotian. I'm glad one has her mother's skin tone, and the other looks like she has a really nice tan. Is this the only way they will be able to avoid racism? Is this the only way I'll be able to protect them from the comments that I had to deflect my whole life? My little one is 3 and she's already noticing things. She asked her mom, why do they have the same skin color and why is daddy and her sister darker? We can educate children at a young age that color isn't what makes you. Maybe we have hope for this future. My wife said she never looked at me based on my color or background. She always saw me as Shay Khan. I think that's because before we were married and had kids, she took the time to get to know who I was, an extremely good-looking man. All kidding aside, though, she saw me for what I was. She saw me for what I want everyone to see, a person. I think minorities should be proud of where they come from, whatever background they have. We should be able to walk around stores and places and not feel we're being targeted or that we might steal. We also need to speak up for one another. For the longest time, I've been okay with letting things go the way they are, water off my back. But I realized that by doing nothing and saying nothing, my children won't have the futures that I envision for them. I won't have the futures that I envision for myself. I want everyone here today that wants to make a change to do this. Look in the mirror and say it starts with me. I have to look in the mirror and say it starts with me. I won't be a victim, but I will speak up for those who can't. In conclusion, thank you once again for having me. I'm glad I was able to share a bit. I hope one day I don't have to be thankful that my children don't look Asian, but thankful that my children are proud of who they are. This region is taking the right steps and letting people's voices be heard, and I look forward to seeing what comes from this. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to speaker 11.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead when you're ready.
Excellent. Thank you. Regional Counsel, Ms. Albright, the Office of the CEO, and Ms. Sergeant James. My name is Vincent Bowry Jr., and I'm the founder of EduThink, a management consulting firm in Cambridge that conducts diversity, equity, and inclusion training in schools and in business. I'm also a member of the Anishinaabe Outreach, a board member. I want to say thank you to all the speakers that have shared their stories yesterday and today. I'm here to share my experiences with systematic racism within Waterloo region. I'll provide you with my insight into the sectors that I feel need to be represented in the advisory committee, and I will propose a plan of action for the areas that the region must address immediately. Our community needs to be a place where everyone feels accepted for who they are. We all know that racism exists in Canada and in Waterloo region. It requires real action, not a political response alone. Racism can come in many forms. It's not always overt. It can be a look, a stare, a word, or a feeling of exclusion. I'm a first-generation Canadian whose parents immigrated from St. Kitts via the UK to Cambridge on a scalding hot summer day in 1966. Throughout my life, my parents have shared with me the struggles that they had to acclimatize to Canada, not because of the cold climate, our affinity for hockey, or our unwielding love for maple syrup and Tim Hortons, but due to systematic racism, unconscious bias, and marginalization. They shared what it is like to work in segregated workplaces where they knew that their upward mobility was limited despite the fact that they are both more educated than many of their managers. They have passed down stories of being denied housing, although they met all of the criteria except for the right skin color. Despite these obstacles, they had built businesses, volunteered with many nonprofit organizations, and ensured that their children received a post-secondary education. Why is this important? Is because the framework of anti-Black racism that existed in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is still prevalent to this day within our communities, including our businesses, classrooms, and areas of public service, including policing and social work. The barriers to entry that existed in 1966 when my parents arrived in the region are still present today. And for our Black citizens, the impact that racism has on us in regards to our mental health, our feelings of acceptance, and our self-worth is immeasurable. There's no way for me to quantify what it is like to be called the N-word, but that is not my focus today. When I think about systematic racism, the first question that I ask is why? Why does it exist, and what are the foundational principles upon which it is built. In Canada, we have an angel complex, wherein we believe that racism resides south of our borders, but this is not the truth. This is just a fallacy. We need look no further than our own community. I want to quickly share with you 3 stories that represent the experience of many Black people in our region. And I'm going to start with policing. Let's start with the fact that if you're a Black, Waterloo Region Police are 4 times more likely to stop you on the street and ask for your identity. We know this tactic to be called carding. I have been carded several times myself for the following offenses: driving while Black, walking while Black, and just for being Black. I know that if I make the wrong move, speak in a certain tone, or move my hands quickly, that may be my last day living. Every Black adult that I know can tell you about a negative experience that they've had with our local police force. And this was compounded by the events of July 5th, in Kitchener, with the arrest of a Somali Canadian and involved police approaching a parked vehicle with weapons drawn, aggressively pulling the man out and beating him on the ground. We're very lucky that the incident was captured on mobile phones by the youth across the street. To quote MPP Laura May Lindo, at a bare minimum, Black Ontarians should be able to interact with law enforcement or receive help for mental health issues without fear of being beaten or killed. The re-traumatization of the Black community on a daily basis is one of the reasons that there is a great mistrust in the Waterloo Region Police Service and police in general. Moving into our education system. Recently, the Ontario government said that they will implement a plan to end streaming in grade 9. The long-standing practice that research has found disappropriately impacts Black and low-income students and severely limits their chance of graduating and even going on to a post-secondary education. I was almost a victim of this practice at Southwood Secondary School in Cambridge in 1995. Even though I had great success in math and was even on my school's math league team, my teacher and guidance counselor recommended that I take general classes instead of advanced classes so it would be easier for me. Luckily, my parents intervened and ensured that I could pursue the more difficult math class, but that decision alone, back in 1995, could have taken away the possibility for me to pursue a university degree at the age of 14. Lastly, in the job market, specifically earlier in my career, in the days before LinkedIn, to date myself, in face-to-face interviews, I saw how hiring managers were surprised that I was Black, that I was that applicant that they saw that resume of. Microaggressions such as, oh, wow, you're well-spoken. Where are you from? No, where are you really from? Were prevalent. My first job at a university was as an HR recruiter, where I would match open positions with job applicants. And working for a particular engineering firm locally, who was searching for a process engineer, I struggled to find anything for their business. I asked to have a candid conversation with the hiring manager, and she shared with me that the applicants that I presented were not a fit for their culture. I asked her to give me a little bit more detail, and she simply wrote, Vince, we're looking for Michael, not Mohammed. This is the Waterloo region that I know. This is why it's called systematic racism. It does not just reside in one area, it permeates across multiple levels of government, business, and the community. All this leads me to ask, what can be done to overcome the monumental task of eliminating systematic racism, which psychologically permeates every aspect of our daily lives? My answer at this time has to start with education on a framework that has upheld white supremacy upon the backs of Blacks and Indigenous people. We can help to make our organizations, cities, schools, police forces, and communities more accepting and supporting if we ensure that our community leaders understand the perceptual, institutional, and psychological processes that impact the way that we interact with one another. We have to identify interventions surrounding unconscious bias and specific diversity and inclusion strategies. For the question of what sectors need to be represented on the advisory committee, I answer, it's not about sectors. It's not about the business community, higher education, or healthcare, and putting those in boxes. Racism is felt in all areas. The advisory committee should comprise of members of the community that can help to formulate and implement a plan of action, not just recommendations. As Black people, our voices need to be heard, respected, and amplified so that people can understand the detrimental impacts that racism has had on the Black community. The advisory committee should be comprised of people who are ready to engage in challenging and courageous conversations. We need to get beyond mere compliance and move towards building a truly aware and inclusive culture. Our next step should have both a top-down and bottom-up approach, with community leaders, members of government, the police force, and education, both the public and the Catholic board, pledging to audit their own organizations to report their findings surrounding anti-Black racism. For the recruitment of the anti-racism advisory group and their recommendations that they will make to council, I need to be able to trust that council will partner with the community group and ensure that the recommendations will receive appropriate funding and venture beyond the region of Waterloo's diversity, accessibility, and inclusion plan and put into action those recommendations. It needs to go beyond a line item or a nice to have and be a foundational construct upon which every other aspect of our community is built. The Anti-Racism Advisory Group, with the support of Regional Council, needs to be adequately funded to ensure that the recommendations can be turned into implementable, actionable items with benchmarks, timelines, and defined criteria for success. Regional Council, we will hold you accountable. We need to develop best practices whereby Regional Council, mayors, and other top government members provide quarterly information sessions to the public that provide the benchmarks that the advisory group aims to meet and impacts that the initiatives have had. But the question of what areas should the region address immediately, my answer is simply policing. Chief Brian Larkin says that the police want to engage the community. Chief Larkin, I ask that you start with engaging your employees. Review the culture of policing within your force and ensure that your current and future officers are trained to identify and eliminate discriminatory practices that can impact minority communities. Effectively allocate a portion of your $120 million budget to anti-racism training to uncover the perceptual and psychological processes that impact the way that individuals interact with people that are similar to them. We must allocate funding to training also to address the mental health crisis in our community, as well as hire trained health professionals responding to mental health emergency calls instead of officers. In closing, we must evolve the community to promote inclusion and ensure that the Black community has opportunities to see ourselves reflected in government, education, policing, and all other areas of daily life. For municipal government and the community as a whole, we need to get out of our collective echo chambers and bubbles and develop policies, bylaws, and legislation to implement practices that reflect the needs and realities of all citizens of diverse backgrounds. This group needs to be trained in change management and project management to make sure that we could have a real framework to lead to success. We need to formulate a 25-year plan with annual benchmarks that are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. We must identify sources of inclusion, align strategies, and improve community engagement to drive positive results. We must identify and eliminate discriminatory practices that can impact members of our community. And finally, to the members of the Regional Council, I implore you, strive to understand the constructs of power and privilege, become aware of your own unconscious bias and how awareness of that can help you to counter stereotypes and discrimination in your own community and in your own life, and understand how poverty, health, wealth, and wellness are all part of this equation. My name is Vincent Bowry Jr. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Vincent. Okay, speaker number 12, you can go when you're ready. Thank you. Your mic.
Me. Good morning, Mino Gijeb. My name is Melissa Ireland. I am a member of Curve Lake First Nation. I am Martin Clan. I'm a part of the Mississauga Nation Diaspora. I'm a resident of Waterloo. I'm an intergenerational survivor of residential schools. I've lived in this region for 20 years. I'm a mom of 2 kids who are Mi'kmaq and Anishinaabe. I serve the Indigenous community. I serve the Indigenous students of Wilfrid Laurier University as Director of Indigenous Initiatives. And I also see myself as a member and contributor of the Indigenous urban community in this region. People share to me that I am known as someone who values relationships, someone who is a navigator, a bridge builder, a door opener for students, graduate, undergraduate, mature learners. People have called me a helper, and people see me as someone rooted in my teachings and connected with a love of the land and a love of my people. So thank you, Miigwech, to the region of Waterloo for starting these difficult conversations. I know that they are difficult, and I appreciate the efforts and trust that you will absorb and listen to the voices that come before you. Today, I want to talk about the diversity of Indigenous identity and the impacts of erasure and invisibility on myself and my family and community, or rather, communities plural. My personal struggles as a First Nations person living in this region is rooted in often a lack of knowledge or a lack of awareness of indigeneity among the general populace. Many people in the general public do not see the complexities, nuances, or historical reasons about why things are the way they are. So in an era of information access to technology, the general public from what I see, are still not doing their own work to understand First Nations, Inuit, Métis people. The burden, this leaves this burden on Indigenous people. It leaves us always moving slowly. It leaves us always educating. And often new people come to the table and then you have to restart that conversation again. So for me personally, this kind of work can be exhausting. Educating colonial operators of your oppression is trauma. Not seeing myself or my culture in the community where I live, which my ancestors have been here since time immemorial, is trauma. Seeing the culture of newcomers celebrated, whereas mine have been oppressed and silenced intentionally from historical Canadian laws and policies, is trauma. So regardless, there is a refusal of the general public to see Indigenous people as contemporary, or that we are all treaty people. Everyone on this land, we are all treaty people. So I ask, when was the last time you looked at that or thought about what that means? And for First Nations Métis people, land, treaty, titles matter. Knowing the history of this land and being in relationship with this land matters. But for most, many don't even understand the languages we use to acknowledge the diversity within our own Indigenous communities. So we're not only just First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. There's over 330 First Nations in Ontario. There's 18 First Nation communities within a 3-hour radius. There's 11 Métis Nation communities, community councils nearby. And yes, we have a majority of Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Métis people, but we have representation from the rest all across Canada that come and live and work in Waterloo region. There are Dene, there are Inuit, Cree, Mi'kmaq. We are adoptees. We are Millennial Scoop. We are Two-Spirit. We are residential school survivors. We are employed. We are homeless. We are status. We are elders. We are youth. We are homeless. We are professionals. And we are so much more, and we are many voices. And we are thriving. We are surviving, and we're still here. And what I've seen is that many people in power don't know the history or the complexity of identity. And this means that they're complicit in the erasure of us. Or if people's voices are different or they see fracture within our communities, many find it too complex and then they walk away or they end up not building relationships with us. They expect many voices to be one voice. Or if they think that they talk to one of us, they talk to all of us. And this does not work. This does not work because it seems to me the loudest Indigenous voices are heard, the ones comfortable in the media or speaking out or having tech or the skills to do so. Only the same voices seem to be heard. So these voices have been given greater agency and power over the many. And these voices often have agendas or reverse. I have witnessed Indigenous voice or voices speak for all Indigenous people, which I find very damaging, especially when they did not ask to speak for the whole community. Again, there are many First Nations, Inuit, Métis people on the sidelines who are tired or fatigued because they are on many committees. So we need to find ways to open up avenues for more diverse Indigenous voices to be heard. I think the region needs to do a strategic plan with true consultation. Number one, I think you need to work with the systems you have working. I think that you need to give resources for people to do their work and also supplement the funding that they do have. Wellbeing Waterloo Region is an Indigenous working group, and I think it's one of them, but there's many opportunities for others. I also see a real lack of data and real lack of general numbers. So we need to know more about who the Indigenous community is in this region, and I think anything that will combat pan-Indigenous approach will work. I think that we not just need numbers, but narratives, and not just First Nations, Inuit, Métis checkboxes or the assumptions within those boxes. We've had some great speakers today, and Indigenous speakers have given you some region stats, but I would like to also point out that there are also thriving Indigenous people in this region who need access to culture and services. There is a thriving economy in this region that is attracting Indigenous professionals who are looking for community, and there are also real needs as well. There are also many people who are suffering. So until we get a really clear picture of needs, you can't make an effective strategy. So I propose doing some really great engagement work to find out who we are, what are the voices. And then I would also propose evaluating existing agencies serving Indigenous people in order to best meet our needs. I would also look at other forms other than town halls. For a lot of people, this is not in a natural setting or an effective way to build relationships. Many people find this very hierarchical and intimidating. So I just wanted to share that. I also think we need Indigenous people on every level of committees and staffing units within your strategy plans. I think we need a comprehensive strategy. You need a recruitment strategy for staff, an Indigenous EDI recruitment strategy. And you know what? We have talent in this region. There are 3 post-secondary institutions in town: Laurier, Waterloo, Conestoga. We have many students in many different areas. There is Indigenous talent in this region. And so
you have 2 minutes remaining.
I also see a huge gap in Indigenous mental wellness and access to culture. And there needs to be true consultation about where those services should be. But again, I stress there's not just one agency voice. A real strategy needs to be Indigenous led, not just with consultants, but with many voices, doing Indigenous innovative feedback sessions, potentially using culture. And I know it's hard when our communities are fractured and there's no clear voice of leadership, and it's not easy for people to understand because it's complex. You don't know what you don't know. But I can say that many of our agencies are under-resourced or tired of fighting or fatigued of education over and over again. But before you do this work, you need a vision, you need relationship, you need knowledges to be gathered before you start doing this. I also stress that the region needs to build its own relationship with the Haldimand Tract treaty holders, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Council and the Six Nations Land and Resource Office, especially as it relates to any land map conversations. I also want to acknowledge that I see good work happening in this region. There have been 2 park projects that the City of Kitchener has been making strides for Indigenous inclusion, and I see that. I've seen that happen before COVID. I've seen great work happening with Waterloo Arts and Culture, Wellbeing Waterloo, the museums. There's a lot of great work to be happening, and I see you, and I see people creating relationships. So I really hope that we can see this movement together, an opportunity for my children, and I really hope this region understands the complexities and sees dangers of only listening to the loudest voices. We need to work together to create spaces and ways to listen so that people want to come to the table and build relationships. Chimagwech.
Thank you very much. Okay, we will go to our speaker number 13, and then we will take our 10-minute break after that. Go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. I want to thank the region for organizing this very important town hall, and thank all the previous speakers this morning who have shared with us some very powerful personal stories. I appreciate the opportunity to add my voice to this conversation. My name is Daiene Vernile, and the perspective that I hope to offer is from my service as a local news journalist for over 30 years and as a former elected representative. So the region is specifically asking us to address 3 issues in this topic. How has racism impacted us? What sectors need to be represented on the advisory committee that's being formed? And what areas should the region address immediately? In terms of personal impact, I'm the daughter of Italian immigrants. During my early years, we experienced poverty. At times in school and in the workplace, there was sexism. However, I recognize that as a white person, there are tacit privileges, unseen and unconscious advantages that often open doors and make life easier. I have benefited from white privilege. It was through my work as a news journalist that I had the opportunity on many occasions to help tell stories of people affected by bigotry. And then as a member of provincial parliament, I had the opportunity to fight for and to bring in some strong measures to address systemic racism in Ontario. So here in Ontario, we like to pride ourselves on our multiculturalism and celebrating our differences. Some people might think that racism does not exist in Waterloo region or in Ontario. And as we've heard this morning from various speakers who shared their very real and some disturbing stories, disturbing accounts, that is not the case. I can tell you that on Province-wide, a television program that I produced and anchored at CTV Kitchener for almost 30 years, that systemic racism was a topic that we covered often. A local professor reached out to me during Black History Month a few years ago. She wanted to challenge the very naive view that Canada somehow has a kinder, gentler relationship with people in the African diaspora compared to our neighbors to the south. In fact, she reminded us that in our history, our early history in Canada, we had slavery. And that over time and still to this day, that Black citizens do not have the same opportunities in education, careers, housing, and more. When we broadcast that segment, it was overwhelming to see the reaction, the feedback that we had from people in our community who also wanted to share their personal experiences. Shortly after 9/11, we produced a town hall on the targeted racism that our Muslim neighbors were facing in this community. We gave them an opportunity to express their frustrations and their fears. As an MPP, I often met with representatives within our local Indigenous population to hear about their very specific issues tied to job insecurity, finding adequate housing, dealing with addiction, and the fallout of the very abusive residential school system. I was very happy to fight with them to secure funding for some of their programs. And in 2016, when I learned that Ontario was going to be forming an anti-racism directorate and that Waterloo is not on the list of communities that was being consulted, I contacted the minister responsible, Michael Coteau, and I strongly urged him to consider putting KW on the list because we had experiences and constructive ideas to share. So I was quite happy that after that conversation that KW was included. The directorate came here in October of 2016. It was a very well-attended town hall meeting at City Hall in Kitchener. We heard from ordinary citizens to frontline workers to experts, and everyone was brilliant. The feedback that was offered in Kitchener and the other communities the directorate visited helped to form the foundation of an anti-racism strategy. We knew that in order to ensure longevity and sustainability of that work, and I share this because I think it's foundational and can serve our region, we came to the conclusion of these three things. One, legislation was necessary. Two, we needed to mandate race-based data collection and public reporting. And three, that we needed to address systemic racism in the education, child welfare, health, and justice sectors. In early 2017, a strategic plan was introduced, and shortly after that, an Anti-Racism Act was passed. And although it was a provincial action plan, and by the way, this is what it looked like, I will say that there's information in this that I think is useful and can be gleaned and used here in Waterloo region. So your second question, what sectors need to be represented on the advisory committee? And again, based on my experience as a journalist and as a former elected representative, I would suggest the Black community, Indigenous, Islamic, Semitic, and any other group that is experiencing systemic racism. Your third question, what areas should the region address immediately? I'm going to offer 6 suggestions. The first, create an advisory committee. Well, you're already doing this, which is a very positive step. I would encourage you to bring in diverse voices that represent different sectors: education, social services, healthcare, and justice. Look for community leaders, experts, and ordinary citizens who bring lived experiences and constructive ideas. 2, to the region, I would suggest that you examine your own hiring and advancement policies within your public service. Racial imbalances can be deeply embedded in the practices and procedures of any organization, and this can prevent people from reaching their full potential. This is going to require self-examination of your employment cycle. Look at recruitment, advancement, and look at your workplace culture. If a regional employee, for instance, has an issue with racism, how easy is it for them to get support? The region is telling us that it's committed to addressing systemic racism, which is great. It makes sense for you to start at home. 3, collect data. And this is going to inform you in creating policy and making decisions. I know that this can be challenging at the local level as there's a cost associated with doing that. So I would encourage you to reach out to your provincial partners. The Ministry of Education, Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, the the Ministry of the Attorney General, and the Anti-Racism Directorate can provide racialized data. Look at dropout rates, enrollment at post-secondary institutions, incarceration stats, poverty rates. We heard from one of our speakers this morning that COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting diverse and poor neighborhoods. It's really critical to have a clear understanding of the numbers in order to create evidence-based solutions. 4, increase community engagement and capacity building. Through community centers and through schools, we can support targeted engagements with racialized communities and anti-racism advocates. Start with leaders in these communities. Invite them to meet monthly. Ask them to bring their problems, their ideas. And rather than just talking about these issues, and we've heard this morning that talk is cheap, we need action, I would say create a specific mandate, create timelines, create deliverables. Then engage the region's supports, which can start with connectivity to existing programs. Develop an annual reporting on these engagements with these communities so you can measure where you have successes and where you have shortcomings. Public awareness, number 5. Public education is really critical to helping create a society where citizens are aware of and can identify and challenge racism. I encourage the region to carry out baseline research to gauge the public's understanding and perceptions of systemic racism. And here's my last point, number 6, promote the complaints process. This is actually easy to do because these offices already exist. The region could promote this information online in community centers, arenas, libraries, other public places, and in local media. A person who feels that they've experienced racism in the region can contact the Ontario Human Rights Commission. There's the Ontario Rights Tribunal of Ontario. And if you're looking for assistance, if you need some advice, there is the Human Rights Legal Support Center. Unfortunately, there are many people who don't even know that these supports exist, so I think it's good public policy to share this information. And finally, I will share with you that I was very disappointed to hear that the budget for the Anti-Racism Directorate, this is the provincial directorate, has been cut back. This happened soon after the 2018 change in government and the annual anti-racism conference that was mandated in the legislation. That hasn't happened with the new folks who are in power at Queen's Park, and it's a lost opportunity. However, I think at the local level, I think that there's a lot of good ideas that we can glean from previous work that has been done addressing systemic racism. Again, it's so encouraging to know that this is a front burner issue for our region here in Waterloo region. I want to thank everyone who's working on this and to everyone who spoke today and shared their personal experiences. And respectfully, I appreciate the opportunity as a former journalist, as a former public servant, and as an ally to add my voice to this very important conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so we are going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll reconvene with speaker number 14. Okay, perfect. Okay, that was the fastest 10 minutes in history. So we are now back, and we are going to begin with speaker 14. Okay, we are going to move on to speaker 15. Are they back? Okay, all right. So we will welcome speaker 14 into the room.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, okay, speaker 15, welcome. Okay, I can hear you. You can begin when you're ready, please.
Sounds good, thank you. Sorry about the technical challenges. I'm at work. So I'm just gonna sort of go by question and kind of like address as much as I can. So for the first question that was asked, I've lived in Waterloo region for over 15 years now. I came to Canada when I was about 14 years old and entered high school. And unfortunately, racism has impacted my life from that point. And the school was actually one of the spaces that created a lot of that kind of violence. And it began with like classmates and things like that with racial slurs, but a lot of it came from counselor's office and how I was able to move towards my career. So in the beginning, I had no idea what was going on with school. And so I naturally went to the counselors to kind of seek assistance. And I was immediately forwarded to do applied courses just because it's easier for me, even though I spoke English well. And from that point on, that has impacted the rest of my 15 years in Canada. So a lot of what has affected me has been just deemed unable to do the work just because I had an accent and because of the skin of my color. So one of the things for me that has impacted my life until this day is how folks of color, specifically Black students, are treated in schools, in high schools, and how they're supported through their education to be able to overcome the barriers that are there, and how they can really achieve their dreams and their passions without having to forego racism in terms of their capacity to be able to do things. So personally, I think I have definitely internalized all of that to feel like I'm not capable of achieving the things that I wanted to achieve because the foundation was set for me that I'm not able to do certain things. So I would say that the sectors that that are really important to be represented in the advisory committee would be education and mental health. So education, it is important to be able to support the young people, the folks of color that are facing racism, even if they don't know how to articulate it. What happens is that they internalize it and it affects them for the rest of their lives. So I would feel that it is important to figure out ways to support those students in those schools, as well as I think mental health. I think that a lot of folks not only internalize just that specific aspect, but also internalize racism everywhere they go. Like, for example, since I've been in Canada, I have been stopped in grocery stores, in drugstores, in malls, just to be checked if I stole something. This happened to me 2 weeks ago. I'm a 30-year-old woman with a child. So there's a lot of those things that have been internalized. And I think that generally, I feel like I don't have a space to address this mental health struggles that I face. So having even folks of color and Black people that are counselors and therapists to support these students in ways that actually really make sense, where they don't have to go to therapists and explain their context for an hour or 2 or 3 sessions that costs a lot of money. So I would say that maybe the mental health and education just should really be represented in those advisory committees. And right now, I think that the region should address, again, just going back to the mental health, because I think a lot of folks are struggling right now with what's going on. And they're having to explain it to their employers, they're having to explain to their professors, their teachers, their facilitators, saying, listen, I'm going through a lot right now, and I need time. Or like, I'm going through a lot right now because there's a lot of violence that is happening towards Black folks. And so I think that having space to kind of process these things, but then also just gain some support in that aspect. So I think at the moment, I would say that that would be something the region should address immediately. But then again, this is just thoughts of a Black woman. But I also work in the mental health sector, so that probably influences the way that I think. So that's sort of just what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, hello. Hi there.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Welcome.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you for asking. Yes, it's nice to meet you all. And my name is Alim Nathoo, and I wanted to say thank you very much to everyone that has spoken today. Everyone has shared some really great stories, and it's very sad to see that racism still exists in Waterloo region. I was a former resident of Waterloo region, and let me just add that I faced a lot of racism and discrimination in Waterloo region. And I want to be clear on a few things. I grew up in Sarnia, Ontario, and I lived in Windsor, London, Kitchener, and now currently Toronto. And I just want to add that the most racism that I've ever faced was Waterloo region. Whether if it's dealing with public transit officials, whether if it's dealing with police services, whether if it's dealing with restaurant servers at restaurants, whether if it's dealing with sales associates in stores. And a lot of it I found was microaggressions and attitude. And let me add one thing. Once in 2015, I was working at the Rogers building down on Weber and Frederick, and I was walking out of the building for my break. And there was a police officer that stopped me once. And I waved my hand to let the officer know I was crossing the road. He stopped at the yield sign to let me cross the road. Then I looked and I said, thank you. And the officer pulls me to his cruiser, to his car, and he says to me, you should wait until I stop to let you cross the road. And I mean, It's ridiculous. And I said, thank you for looking out for my safety. Have a nice day. So this is one example of racism I have faced in Waterloo region. Another example of racism I have faced is I had a bus driver one time tell me that because I talked to the bus drivers, someone referred to me as a hyper brown boy once, behind my back. And the other issue is that on January 26th, 2017, I was going home from Conestoga College. This was around approximately 3:50 p.m. where this happened. This was on, Manitou Drive, just near, just on the 10 Conestoga College route, if I can remember, where one time I was at Conestoga College and I saw two international students get on the bus. They were at the bus stop, and the bus driver was so rude to these two international students. She's like, quickly and hurry up. And I said, I don't appreciate your attitude. I'd like to make a complaint because I witnessed this happen. So she gave me the number. I phoned in and I made a complaint, and I told the operator with the region of Waterloo that this driver behaved this way. I'm on the bus. I don't want to get thrown off because I'm phoning you and making a complaint. The driver heard me. She pulled the bus, called her supervisor, and asked me to leave. And a supervisor escorted me to the car, and we discussed the incident. I gave my photo ID, which was my Ontario driver's license, just to show who I was. And the supervisor asks me if he could take a photograph of it. And at that time, I actually said, why not? Go ahead. But this is the policies that need to change in Waterloo region. Like, there's a lot of issues with racism and discrimination that is existent. And I remember when I lived in my apartment once, there was another that harassed me once in a laundry room back in 2014. I believe this was October or November, if I can recall. And I had to call the police as per my landlord's instructions. So when I called the police and explained to them that I was called a Paki, and then they blocked me from exiting the laundry room, I explained to them the story. I didn't call the police because they called me that racial slur. I called the police because they were harassing me. And the police officer said to me, well, you can't charge somebody for calling your name, just become so defensive. Then about a couple days later, another similar incident happens again. And I called the police and I asked them not to dispatch this officer. They gave me the same officer, and he says, your story doesn't make any sense. Your story doesn't add up. You're the one that caused the problem. When 2 days ago, he should have gone and investigated that. This was back in 2014. This is absolutely unacceptable for how regional employees behave. And let me just say that there was one incident as well when I was on the city bus where there were these two people using the N-word on the bus because the driver, who was black, allowed them to ride the bus for free. And these guys were using racial slurs. And as Karen Redman and everybody knows, I ended up getting respect signs installed on the buses. However, this was not acceptable with how this bus driver was actually treated. And let me just say one thing is this call center agent by the name of Meg was nice enough to involve her supervisor to make sure that this incident was taken care of. So, and also I want to say kudos to Skylar. Just recently when I had to have the regional chair call me because I made a complaint about Les Armstrong for his White Lives Matter post. I've already filed a complaint with the Integrity Commissioner. So these are two amazing call center representatives. But when I've made other complaints about how bus drivers have behaved in the past, let me just add that some of these call center agents have been rude, disrespectful, showing microaggressions, potential racism. And I have to say that, and Daiene Vernile mentioned that there needs to be policies in place to address these concerns as well. So I wanted to also share some of these policies that the city of Windsor has when it comes to dealing with customer service that I think the region of Waterloo should implement. And these are their standards. We will treat you with dignity and respect. We will treat you fairly while complying with all of our policies, bylaws, and regulations. We will ensure that all of our services are accessible for all of our customers. We will respond to your written correspondence within 3 business days. We will respond to your telephone correspondence within 2 business days. We will identify ourselves to you by our first name and the department that we work for. We will provide our service in the most cost-effective manner possible. I think these are service standards that the region of Waterloo should implement. And I think what needs to be addressed in the advisory committee and the three services that need to be addressed is Service First Call Center, Grand River Transit, and Waterloo Regional Police, and social services based on what other people have said as well. I also want to add as well that with the way that certain residents have conducted themselves and behaved themselves, and I'm also going to say also other politicians that have ran for other parties that think racism does not exist, or they pretend it does not exist. Like, for example, the Green Party. That's one party that I found some of the candidates, they don't really want to even address this problem that I've ran in previous elections. Now, let me just also add as well that when I lived in Waterloo region, I have found from my experience, this is where I faced the most racism and discrimination. I ended up leaving the city to move to Toronto because I transferred for another job, but also because of these particular problems. I moved from London to Kitchener back in 2014 because I thought Waterloo region was a progressive city, or a progressive region. I apologize. Apparently, it doesn't seem that way when I lived there for 4 years. From September 2014 to May 2018. It's unacceptable that this region should have hosted a public consultation on this 3 years ago, back in June, when I mentioned that racism was a problem, and now that you guys are doing it as we speak. And I appreciate that this is being done. Better late than never. That's what I have to say. But I just want to add as well that I also recommend that the region of Waterloo take the quote of Sarnia Mayor Mike Bradley's quote, also with hiring people with disabilities, where he said there are two types of, right now, you can't have two types of citizens, one that has access and one that doesn't. And I feel like Waterloo region has not done enough, not only to hire diverse people, but they have not done enough to hire people with disabilities as well. And I was just recently diagnosed last year on the autism spectrum. There needs to be better training, better de-escalation, and better communication training on the front lines. There also needs to be more investment in social services and mental health. Now, I also think that police services need to have less than 7.5 hours of de-escalation training. It seems like they have about 30 hours of training with other things as opposed to de-escalation. And I want to mention that this needs to be addressed as soon as possible. I appreciate you taking the time to letting me speak, but we need to do more on this. As the sign on Guelph Transit says, courtesy costs nothing, I think Waterloo region needs to go and think on those terms as well. Once again, thank you very much, and I hope you have a sparkling day.
Thank you very much for your comments. And we're going to go back to our speaker number 14, who I believe is ready now. Okay, so we're going to move to speaker number 17. Hello, good afternoon. You can begin when you're ready.
Hi, thank you. And thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak today. So my story begins when my parents fled from Eritrea, a country ravaged by war where a safe future was not possible for them. It is a story that is not foreign to oppression and inequality, a story that knows all too well how injustices and adversities infiltrate, spill over, and seep through and across borders. Hardships followed my parents while immigrating into the Kitchener-Waterloo region and have showed up in the most insidious of ways. As a young Black Muslim woman, I have tried time and time again to advocate and do my part in alleviating them from discriminations they have faced. But over time, I have realized it is not people they are up against, but rather an entire system. A system that has perpetuated oppression on Black, racialized, and Indigenous people way before my parents and will continue to after they are gone. My story is intertwined in their narration of this same system. I was born and raised in Kitchener-Waterloo region, in a white majority city where microaggressions has become the norm for me. I chose to go to the University of Waterloo, an institution that prides itself on its international and diverse student population. Yet I was one of less than 10 Black students in my graduating class of 150 people. Despite the fact that we were already a very small minority, and despite the racism and microaggressions many of us experienced, with close to no support from the institution, we had to fight hard to create services that addressed racism and xenophobia on campus. Imagine that, facing racism, xenophobia, and hostility on campus, and then having to fight to create spaces and resources that address these issues. That's the world we live in as Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks in this region. Beyond these challenges, in my post-secondary studies, I simultaneously had to navigate racism in my day-to-day life, such as being yelled at to go back to my country, threatened removal of my hijab, being called the N-word at my job, and police officers barging into my home for unwarranted searches. This is my reality and the reality of so many Black, Indigenous, and racialized people in the region of Waterloo. We face these challenges while also attempting to live normal lives by going to school, working, and supporting our families with little to no culturally sensitive resources that aim to help us navigate the unique challenges we face. A 2019 Immigration Matters survey carried out by the Immigration Partnership of Waterloo Region found that out of 966 responses, 48% had experienced discrimination in workplaces, 36% in restaurants, 36% at community events, and 20% when looking for housing, demonstrating that anti-Black racism is not something we can escape. Anti-Black racism is interconnected, systemically driven, and deeply rooted in the very place we call home. The experience of anti-Black racism is heightened for refugee and immigrant communities due to existing trauma, in addition to the challenges of learning a new language, finding affordable housing, navigating the Canadian health system, and finding employment, amongst many other things. In the Immigrants and Growth, a look at health and employment in Waterloo Region report, it stated that Waterloo Region currently has the 5th highest per capita immigrant population of all urban areas in Canada. We cannot push or postpone the need to invest and create services that bring justice to the sizable population of immigrants, refugees, Black, racialized, and Indigenous communities. The lack of racial statistics in the Kitchener-Waterloo region is a huge indicator of how much still needs to be done. Evidence-based approaches allow marginalized communities to voice their experiences, thoughts, and opinions of what needs to be done in order to move towards closing the economic equality gaps. While our anecdotes and experiences are powerful, the lack of investment in systematically understanding the barriers and challenges that impact racialized groups in the Waterloo region speaks volumes. We must make it a priority to actively invest in learning about Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities. We must move past merely consulting with communities that are most impacted by anti-Black racism and ensure that their leadership and expertise is centered in the creation of the services, programs, and resources to address racism while compensating them properly. I am a co-founder of an organization called Project Up, a grassroots initiative in the Waterloo region that supports young Black Muslim women and girls to unleash their potential through community building, resource sharing, and skills development. Our work at Project Up seeks to address discrimination and barriers faced by Black Muslim girls and originated out of our own experiences of being unable to find accessible, safe, and supportive spaces. We took it upon ourselves to make sure this would not be the case for a young generation of Black Muslim girls. It is organizations like ours that do the hard work, despite lack of financial funds to ensure our sustainability. The onus should not always be on marginalized communities to support each other because we are consistently overlooked by the larger community. Black, Indigenous, and racialized people should not be disregarded except to be tokenized for the purpose of symbolic representation. or to have semblance of diversity in organizations and spaces that otherwise do not prioritize or actively engage in supporting our communities. These patterns are prevalent in our community, they are harmful, and they must end. The first step to bettering ourselves as a community is recognizing that racism exists right here in the Waterloo region. It exists in our schools and universities, in our parks, in our community organizations, and in our workplaces. Not only does it exist, it is also reinforced in our institutions. It is violent and traumatic and undermines our vision for what we want our region to be. And it is what I'm talking about is the heightened surveillance of communities of color across Kitchener Waterloo and the implicit criminalization of those communities. A 2016 study found that if you are Black, Waterloo Regional Police are 4 times more likely to stop you on the street and ask for your identity without accusing you of a crime. This is the same police department that earlier this month brutally arrested a Black immigrant man with known mental health challenges out of fear he had fired a weapon at police officers. This is the same police department that realized only after their forceful apprehension of this man that no weapon existed and they had mistaken fireworks for a firearm. It breaks my heart to know that even here in the Waterloo region, Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities are fighting to live in a community that values their lives, who are also invested in dismantling barriers to their livelihoods, ensuring safety and equity in our communities, and committed to abolishing racism in all of its forms, institutionally and otherwise. For these reasons, it is essential for the advisory committee to include people from Black, Indigenous, and racialized community that come from various sectors, such as nonprofit, health sector, and the educational sector, among other sectors. We must include people that are also not found in these sectors, but instead are trusted leaders who focus their time in the community. And most importantly, we must include Black, racialized, and Indigenous youth who are found in all these spaces and will be most impacted by the solutions we create today. In order to reduce the harm that has been inflicted in our communities, we must defund the Waterloo Regional Police and remove police from communities and educational institutions. The $200 million that has been allocated to the Waterloo Regional Police Service this year, which was increased by $10 million over the 2019 budget, is more than what has been spent on public health, senior services, housing services, and the library combined. In order to adequately support Black, racialized, and Indigenous people, this money must be reallocated towards education, public transit, mental health, social services, social support equity initiatives such as increased access to affordable housing, harm reduction services, accessible rehabilitation, conflict resolution services, reintegration services, and other vital community-based support systems. Waterloo Region needs to start listening to Black, Indigenous, and racialized people when they tell you what is wrong. Listen and acknowledge that we are saying listen and acknowledge that what we are saying is coming from decades, generations, and centuries of pain and persecution, oppression, and injustice. Listen to us carefully as we reimagine a world free of shackles and violence and do the hard work of dreaming up futures where all of our people are free to live long, safe, and fulfilling lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I believe our next speaker is not here, so I'm going to move to speaker 19 if you want to join in.
Hello, Professor Karen. Can you hear me?
Hello, I can hear you. When you're set up, you can go ahead.
Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, that's right. I was expecting speaker number 18 will continue, and so immediately comes. So I have to set up myself. Hopefully you will see me properly. Did you get me now?
We can see you. You're good. We can hear you.
Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, for that. Okay. Thank you very much. And you can hear me very well?
I can hear you. You're good.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm so glad that I see different peoples and raise different forms of the racism, racialized lives in Canada and specifically in the region of Waterloo. And I would like to share in my parts, maybe a little bit different from what it has been. So what it has been said is, as existed, it is real. And I wanted to continue, but I tried to share my PowerPoints, but I will present it here anyway to save my time. And I would like to go from some points as a point of things. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to just go through to remind what some of the housekeeping staffs and what racism is, and my background, and how racism impacted me, and what sectors we have to should be represented by the advisory committee, and what areas should the region immediately address. On this point, I will continue to discuss on this point as much as I can with my time. And just to give it to the
You're muted.
Mute. Did you mute me?
Nope, you're good now. We can hear you again.
Okay, my PowerPoint, somebody, I think in there, they started and they take it off. I have it here, so no problem. Okay, so I don't want to go to the definition of what racism is and the systematic racism or institutional racism. Actually, we know it and people already speak about it. I will start with my background. And I'm Canadian, but by origin, I'm an Ethiopian who resided for 16 years in Ontario. And with a family, 2 kids. Let me give you some of my background as educational, in my education, leadership, and my work experience, which I have, just to give you some highlight. Previously, I've been graduated as a biologist. I was a BSc, and I used to work as a senior epidemiology expert in the Ministry of Health of Ethiopia in federal government. I have been a zonal administrator, zonal chief, representing the province, the provincial health offices, and had been head of surveillance in Ethiopia. And I have got a scholarship to do my master's in U.S. in New Orleans, in Louisiana, U.S. As the University of Tulane University School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. I have been graduated with a GPA of 3.83, and with that, I have been given a good to continue with my PhD, but because of my government and because of the political situation of Ethiopia, I couldn't go back to my country. So I have to flee to Canada, and thanks to Canada government for receiving me, and stayed in Canada for 16 years, as I said. And after I came to Canada, I applied with masters. I tried to apply, join RN programs, and but I tried to continue my education with public health, but I couldn't. I applied, but I have never been accepted. So I tried, and to switch to support my families, I have to change my education into a nursing program, and apply for RN program. And they refused me, and they put me on a waiting list. I have held a master's in public health in Tulane University, and when I came to Canada, even I couldn't get a nursing program. And with that, I was so frustrated. And finally, after fighting with the registrar and the higher program directors, I have been offered to join a practical nursing program. So I took that opportunity. I have been in a practical nursing program, a registered practical nursing for 12 years. And as a nurse, in that sense, again, I tried to join another company in Hamilton. That was in Mohawk College and in Hamilton. And at the same time, there was another health center by virtue of opportunity, thanks God, and I have got to continue my research experiences by being a project coordinator in Hamilton Community Center, and I have been there almost for 2 years. I have worked for project coordinator. And through that, I started to join a certificate clinical research programs in McMaster University, and I graduated with certified clinical researcher. And I came back again in Hamilton, the same, I became a data designer as well, a database designer. And with all this struggle, I'm a lifelong learner, and I started to continue my education with my public health, and with all my education, I applied to a public health, a PhD program, and I graduated with a PhD program as epidemiology in February 2019, and I become a doctor, a PhD holder now. After several fighting, several things in life, and I try. Now I try to be again added with this. I try to add values and skills. Now I am continuing with data science to be a data scientist and project manager. This is what, as a lifelong learner. And with all this problem, and in the meantime, these things comes. I try to apply to McMaster University School of Graduate Studies, to University of Toronto School of Graduate Studies. With all my education, they declined. Because of the reason, finally, I identified that because I have a slang, my pronunciation, I'm a black man, and because I'm from Africa. And with all my education in America, in Ethiopia, in all this, they declined to give me. That's why I try my best and to join a PhD program in US.
You have 2 minutes remaining.
Okay. And with this, I try to continue my work in nursing. But the difficult thing is it's difficult to maintain a full-time position. They always give you a part-time position and a short-time employment, and lack of sustainable and persistent employment. Then they terminate you without any cause. And currently, with my PhD, I'm currently accepting it is guilty for me that as a PhD, as a doctor in public health, as a epidemiologist, I'm getting served the COVID emergency rehabilitation benefit. I'm living with it, with my families. And it is shame for me. I tried to apply in many places, in University of Waterloo, University of Wilfrid Laurier, and I didn't know that at this point, there is a clear racism in there, a systematic racism affecting my life as a professional career. And with all these things, I try my best to manage myself with this, and it is difficult to continue. What do you believe that need to be represented in advisory committee is all institutions, public health, Ministry of Health, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, Ministry of Training, Social and Community Services, Visible Minorities, Immigrant-focused organization, Indigenous community organization, women's focus, and professional associations should be represented. What area should the region address immediately is equal employment opportunities, review of employment procedure, focus on equity, diversity, and inclusiveness. I am a member of the City of Kitchener, the EDU,
That concludes your time.
Equity, Diversity, and Inclusive Committee members. I'm working actively in there to bring a change. Give me 1 minute. Give me 1 minute, Dr. And defending the police. And mostly it has to be focused on social services, public health, and all these areas has to be, I think, should be investigated, should be at least reviewed, and should be at least this racism has to be avoided. And I would like to finally, just to give a personal statement. I would like to serve my region of Waterloo, to take advantage of my education, my experiences, and I would like to be part of the advisory committee too, if I have been given an opportunity. Thank you very much for hearing.
Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, so I believe that we don't have speakers number 20 and 21. So we're going, 21 is there? Okay, so we are going to move to speaker number 23, as the previous speakers are not here yet, okay?
Okay, I'm gonna start. Whoops, I guess I better go upstairs. Go ahead here.
Hello, good afternoon. When you're ready, you can begin.
Hello, thank you. My name is Lannois Carroll-Woolery. I've been a resident of Waterloo region for 28 years, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I have a slideshow, and I'm just wondering how to present it to you. Let me start it here and see if that, can you see my video?
Not yet.
Your screen, I got it.
We can do it from our end if we have it.
Okay.
Okay, we're good.
Can you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay, still good, right?
We are good.
We're good, okay. So I'll jump right in. So as I said, my name, by way of introduction, I just want to present myself as I'm Jamaica born. I moved to Canada in 1991 at age 20. That's just after high school. I have 3 children who are all Canadian born. I'm an IT worker right now. I'm a University of Waterloo graduate, and I've been a resident of Waterloo region since 1992, so about 28 years. And I'm currently president of the Caribbean Canadian Association of Waterloo region. That's since late last year. And I only present this because I'd like you to understand where I'm coming from with my comments and with my perspective. Oftentimes I'm asked by friends, by family members, is Canada a racist country? I don't think that's the right question. And if you ask the wrong question, you're gonna get the wrong answer. Because racism is not an attribute of an individual. It's not an attribute of a country. It's an attribute of an individual. Personally, in Canada, I have been told to go back where you came from. I have had a neighbor who did not wish for their children to play with my children. I have been continually challenged, questioned, and watched. So these are just some of the negative behaviors that I have experienced. But I've also experienced a lot of positive interactions with Canadians, with white Canadians. I've had encouragement from friends and neighbors. I come from a strong family. Both my parents worked in the Toronto District School Board for over 25 years, and they've been married about, my mother and my stepfather have been married about 40 years. So I have strong family support. As a matter of fact, myself and my two younger siblings are all graduates of the University of Waterloo. And I have a Commonwealth background. That means that my first language is English. I'm used to dealing with the Queen. And I actually visited Canada as a child. I visited Canada on vacation before I moved here as an adult. So I've had both negative and positive experiences in this country with regard to racism and prejudice. But I have continually heard from other persons about blatant aggressions and microaggressions in my 28 years here. So just to give you just a few examples, what does systemic racism look like here in Waterloo region? It means that sometimes bus drivers drive past children of color when they're standing at a bus stop. It means that sometimes retail staff follow you or they stand behind you to monitor your behavior. It means differential disciplinary treatment in school, in our schools. So if you're a person of color, you're much more likely to get suspended or expelled. If you're not a person of color, they seem to think that the best steps to take are to talk through the issue. It means not being able to get a job interview despite your qualifications. It means being questioned about why you're in a certain location, you're lost, or if you need assistance because they don't think that you belong in that space. It means the police pulling you over, but not having anything to charge you with. So they run a check on your license, they run a check on your plates, and then they let you go. It means all your achievements and your credentials are always questioned and challenged. And this hasn't happened to me personally because, as I said, I'm a graduate of the University of Waterloo, but I've heard over and over again that for many of persons of color in this community, employers question whether their degrees are actually valid, whether their training is actually valid. It means being afraid of walking alone in certain areas. And we've heard other speakers talk about this. This is something that's should be understood by now. So with the systemic racism that persons of color in this community have always experienced, 2020 was the perfect storm. Layered on top of the systemic racism was police brutality, and a number of speakers have already talked about that. I won't go into detail. COVID-19, everybody knows it impacts persons of color and persons who are poor. And of course, the economic shock, the layoffs. So the Black community and other persons of color, this has been a traumatic year for them. And the result of that has been significant increases in stress levels, both physically, mentally, and spiritually as well. And as president of the Caribbean Association, I have had a number of members of our community reach out to me and ask me to help them get mental health support for themselves and for their children because they were having trouble dealing with the layers of stress of the racism and the videos of George Floyd and the job layoffs. And I have been trying to connect persons in our community with persons of color who provide mental health support. Is Waterloo region the best place to live? We have the 10th largest metropolitan area in the country. We have a multicultural populace. According to the region of Waterloo's own population, own census figures, 20% of the population were visible minorities in 2016. We have a lot of natural resources and green spaces that we're proud of. We've got 2 universities, colleges that are highly regarded. We're the headquarters of many companies. We're a technology hub. So when I think of this region, this is a region that has high incomes, and that's known. And I've put links in the slide. I can share this presentation later on. We're known to have one of the highest incomes in the province. We also have a lot of environmental wealth. We also have very smart people. The 2 universities in this region are rated as among the best universities in the country. And the college is also highly rated. We're an innovation hub. And so that, I just want to point out here that even though Waterloo region is considered a really great place to live, persons of color often don't get to enjoy the benefits of this space, of this region. We're made to feel that we don't belong, we don't deserve anything good, that we are a drag on this society. I understand that systemic racism and prejudice is a problem across Canada, but I'm struck by the wealth of resources we have in this region, juxtaposed against a high incidence of racism and racist acts in this region. The fact that we have all this wealth and all this intellect suggests to me that we have the money and the smarts, and we have all the information that we need.
2 minutes remaining.
So, what's missing? If we have the money, if we have the smarts, if we have the information, if we have the knowledge, could it be that there's no will, there's no political will to make the changes that we know need to be made? Bold leadership is needed. I've been talking through a framework with friends and family and colleagues around protection, empowerment, and guidance. The leaders of this community need to protect persons of color in this community. We need to collect and use racialized data in the police services, in schools, in places of employment. Stop companies from putting Black persons on their web pages, but not actually hiring any Black persons within their companies. Investigate complaints, publicize findings. Zero tolerance for racist acts and racist groups. Empower the persons of color in this community by increasing their visibility, putting them in positions of leadership. Education and skills, targeted assistance for families, community groups, community associations is needed. We also need to provide guidance, Black history education for all, so people don't think Blacks are recent comers to this community. Identify BIPOC leaders and provide them with opportunities and resources to impact their communities, and mentorship programs that connect youth and adults to create that community for the BIPOC members that isn't available to them in the wider society. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay, I believe we have speaker number 24.
Waiting. Baker, I know that guy.
Hello, good afternoon. You can begin when you're ready.
Hi, great, thanks. It's wonderful to be here with everybody. Let me first say, I've lived my entire life in this region, and I've always respected our regional government. Sane, stable, consistent, science-based, evidence-based decision-making, generally non-ideological, that promotes inclusive rather than divisive politics. In particular, our excellent environmental policies. Those are the kind of policies which regional government should seek to spearhead because they benefit all of us, regardless of race. However, we may be at a turning point now in the overt politicization of our regional government. Maybe it was inevitable as we grew bigger that we would become more like Toronto with its partisan politics and ideology dominating policy. When it comes to this new anti-racism secretariat, exactly how it is implemented may have major consequences for the majority of the residents of the rest of this community, the most serious and contentious demand being to defund or abolish the police. I know that the vast silent majority of citizens in Waterloo region of all races are actually very scared of this sort of language and what it implies for their safety and the safety of their children. But they're also scared to voice those worries publicly. Well, I'm not scared. I was taught in high school that all that's required for bad ideas to spread is for good men to do nothing. They taught me, don't be a bystander, even if you're 1 in 1,000 people. Well, I'm not going to be the man that stays silent and lets this radical idea go unchallenged. Not today. Somebody has to speak up. Now, we're certainly not perfect in Canada or Waterloo region. No place on earth is perfect. To those who may have experienced genuine racism in their lives or in this region, my heart goes out to you. But let's call the idea to defund or abolish the police what it is: Marxism. Whenever this ideology leaves the cozy realm of academic theory and ends up in practice in the real world, it always turns out disastrously. In fact, Marxism is responsible for the deaths of more people than any other ideology in the history, over 100 million and counting. Marxism exploits the inevitable inequities that unfortunately appear in every flawed human society ever tried in history, and it uses those as a justification to try and disrupt and dismantle the entire otherwise successful system. Those are not my words. They were used by speakers last night. I refer to disrupt and dismantle. These ideas are not based on universalist values like classical liberalism or Christianity, which Martin Luther King based his ideas on. Most famously, that people should be judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin. This movement is different. This current iteration of Marxism comes out of radical academic thinking and brewing away in our universities under names like postmodernism and critical theory. Rather than the old economic classes of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, today's Marxism deliberately and systematically divides people into identity groups. But it still pursues the same plan of stoking grievances and pitting these groups against each other to demoralize and destabilize society in order to bring about a social and economic revolution that will supposedly then lead to a Marxist utopia. So this is why we see protests against George Floyd's death suddenly turning into sustained and organized violent rioting in the US, tearing down statues, attacking churches, rewriting histories of nations and prime ministers to cast them, or should I say paint them, in an entirely cynical and negative light. There's a good old saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We need to hold bad cops accountable. Of that, there can be no doubt. But we also have to defend good police because they defend us every day with their lives. You know, sometimes we all take for granted that Canada is an amazing place, that Waterloo region is a special place. It's the prototype for a global village where people from all over the world can come together to create a new start for themselves and put all of the grievances of the past behind them, including often fleeing repressive communist countries. People who were fighting in their home countries for hundreds of years can come and live next door to each other with no continuation of those old animosities. That's amazing. It's not that Canadians forget the past, but we move beyond it and we forgive each other because that's the only way. It's the only way to break the never-ending cycle of revenge. But this new anti-racism movement wants to dwell negatively in the past all the time, bringing up old grievances over and over and over until it poisons the well of our society, so that people become bitter and envious of one another. People have been captured by these Marxist ideas lately. It's the role of government to flip the tables of oppression as a means of helping people heal from old wounds. However, creating a brand new class of wounded people doesn't bring healing. It just creates a cycle of envy and malice and hatred on all sides. The Secretariat preamble specifically mentions it is trying to tackle white supremacy, but there's no better way to spread that abominable idea than by talking about white people as if they're a separate group from everybody else. If we keep repeating terms like whiteness, white privilege, white systems, we'll be doing the work of the white supremacists for them by getting these ideas out there in the public imagination. Pretty soon we'll find ourselves in exactly the same situation as the United States is in right now, where there's extreme political polarization, rioting, looting, vandalism, groups threatening each other with guns, talk of a new civil war. In New York, shootings are up 130% in June from the month before the riots.
You have 2 minutes remaining.
In Chicago, murders are up 78%. This speaks of the impact on everyone when you do things like demoralize your police force by repeatedly telling every cop how awful they are, or when you tie their hands for political reasons. Chairman Redman, I wish you the best of luck with this Secretariat, but I ask you honestly and objectively to consider whether it might end up doing more harm than good. Don't let the hysteria surrounding Donald Trump cloud your thinking and force you to rush into adopting something that's not well thought through. Using language and policies in the Secretariat based on this new breed of Marxism isn't the way to build healthy communities. It will only lead us to further division and suffering. Our society is actually more fragile than people think, and if we kick out the pillars that underlie it, such as good nonpartisan regional government, like a fully funded police force, then we're going to create a situation where everybody is worse off. If we reject both political extremes of the right and the left, then we can go forward with the Secretariat in a positive, constructive, and inclusive way, hand in hand to make a better community for everybody, including those who already live here and people all over the world who want to come and live here for a reason. Because for all of our failings, we've gotten it right more than wrong. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so this concludes the town hall. All our speakers have presented that were here today. I think we have heard stories, we have received feedback, we have received criticism. The region has received insight into steps going forward in terms of addressing and their anti-racism advisory committee. I just want to pull on some themes and some common comments that were made today to reflect on. And you know, we heard that education, mental health, social services, these are all areas that can be addressed immediately. We heard about policing as well. Our community is not immune to racism. I think that's been made very clear and evident by all of our speakers who have spoken today and yesterday evening. I'm going to repeat some of the comments I said yesterday. Institutions disproportionately work to keep Black and Indigenous members of our community oppressed. We do need to look at our policies, our services, and the laws that have been made with the intention of being equal, but we know they have not been applied equally to everybody. And this is what it comes down to. Laws and the way people are dealt with are not applied equally to everybody in this community. So we're here for change. We're talking about intentional change, transformative change specific to the areas that are affected, specific to those affecting Black and Indigenous and people of color within this region. Racism, it intersects with class, with culture, with geography, and it has the ability to change the way we see and value ourselves, and in some cases, the way we see and value our children. So, what are the next steps? Where do we go from here? As many of you are aware, there will be a formation of an advisory committee. And the call is out for those who, it's not based on what your experience is on previous committees, it's what you can bring to this committee to help make change and help direct the region in the actions that they need to take. So this is an open call to the community. I will also point out that the region is compensating this committee. They value the expertise and the insight and the experiences that are going to be brought to the table. That advisory application will go out within the next week, and there will be an announcement for that. Again, I want to thank all of the participants speaking, all of the people listening. I know Regional Council is listening. I know the rest of our community is listening. And this conversation had to take place today and yesterday, and it will continue on. There is a feedback that will be released or that is live for any member of the community who did not speak today to provide their insight and be a part of this conversation and this process and this community engagement. I'm going to turn it over to Chair Redman for her concluding remarks. And again, I want to thank everybody.
Thank you, Colleen, for doing an outstanding job of facilitating this meeting. I guess I'd like to reflect back that there were people that talked about this being a long journey and other people saying we really had to find out where we were in that journey. And I would have to tell you that that's partly what this initiative is all about. I also want to acknowledge that the ACB, the Black Lives Matter, many groups representing African, Caribbean, and Indigenous peoples and services that are offered to those groups within the community by those communities have reached out and have helped inform this town hall and will continue, I trust, to inform this as we go forward. This process is not perfect. It won't be fast enough. But racism needs to be confronted whenever it is experienced. And it's my hope that at the end of the day, and again, I realize that this isn't going to be a quick fix, that Black and Indigenous children and children of color can realize their potential, achieve their dreams, and make mistakes in Waterloo Region without being faced with racism. I want to thank my colleagues who have all been in the listening mode. Many of us have publicly and privately committed to self-reflection on our own journey to educate ourselves, and I know that these presentations have gone a very long way in raising awareness, and many of them because I've heard back from them after last night. So thank you all for committing to something that really has to be a community initiative, and I look forward to all of these voices helping carry this initiative forward. So thank you. I hope everybody has a safe and enjoyable long weekend.